I was seconds away from saving a semiconductor plant from a catastrophic failure that would cost $100,000 an hour when the new chief operating officer called to tell me I was fired. I calmly replied that I understood, pulled my proprietary security key from the main server, and watched the entire facility go completely dark. By the time I got home, my phone was ringing off the hook, with them begging me to return, but what I found waiting for me in my own living room changed absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not demanded, and that true power lies in walking away. My name is Dexter Rollins. I am 69 years old, and for the past 40 years I have been the ghost in the machine. As the chief systems engineer, I built the digital nervous system of the most profitable tech manufacturing plant in the state. I poured my blood, sweat, and decades of accumulated knowledge into making sure that facility ran like a flawless heartbeat. But that Tuesday afternoon, the heartbeat was flatlining. Piercing emergency sirens echoed through the massive server room. The harsh glare of red warning lights bathed the cold metal racks in a sinister glow. The core cooling systems were failing, and the automated fail-safes were caught in a destructive loop. If the temperature in the fabrication wing breached the critical threshold, an entire batch of highly volatile microchips would melt down. The company was staring down the barrel of a loss amounting to $100,000 for every hour the line remained down. Around me, a dozen young technicians were running in circles, their faces pale with sheer panic, shouting technical jargon that meant nothing in the face of a real crisis. I was the only one not panicking. I sat at the central terminal, my hands flying across the keyboard with the calm precision of a surgeon. I was deep inside the core code, bypassing the faulty logic gates manually, redirecting the cooling protocols to save the company millions. I was 50 keystrokes away from stabilizing the grid when the direct line on my console began to ring. I ignored it at first, my eyes locked on the rising temperature gauges on my monitor. But the phone kept ringing, a relentless, demanding shrill that cut through the noise of the sirens. I hit the speaker button without taking my eyes off the screen. It was Carter, our new chief operating officer. Carter was a 30-something executive with a freshly minted business degree, a tailored suit, and absolutely zero practical experience on a factory floor. He had spent the last 3 months walking around the plant like he owned the world, looking down his nose at anyone who wore work boots instead of Italian leather. He did not ask about the blaring alarms. He did not ask why the factory productivity monitors in his plush upstairs office were flashing red. He just cleared his throat and spoke with a sickeningly arrogant, condescending tone. "Dexter," he said, his voice dripping with unearned superiority. "The board is restructuring. We are modernizing our workforce and pivoting to automated intelligence. We no longer require the services of an outdated contractor. You are officially terminated effective immediately. Please pack your personal belongings and have security escort you off the premises." I stopped typing. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The sirens wailed louder, a fitting soundtrack to the sheer audacity of his words. I stared at the flashing red temperature gauge. "Carter," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level, "we are currently in the middle of a critical core overload. If I do not execute this bypass in the next 60 seconds, you are going to lose the entire afternoon production line. I strongly suggest we have this conversation later." Carter let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Nice try, Dexter. Do not try to use scare tactics to hold on to your job. The new automated systems can handle whatever minor glitch you are exaggerating. You are a relic, Dexter, and your exorbitant salary is bleeding our budget dry. In fact, our chief financial officer just finished reviewing the numbers, and he completely agrees with me. It is time for you to step aside and let the younger generation take the wheel. Leave your access badges on the desk." The mention of the chief financial officer hit me harder than the firing itself. The CFO was Bradley, my own son-in-law, the white man who had married my daughter Tasha and who I had personally bailed out of financial ruin just 3 years ago. Bradley was the one who had reviewed the budget. Bradley was the one who had agreed I was too expensive to keep around. The absolute betrayal settled into my chest like a block of ice. Decades of loyalty, decades of building this place from the ground up, erased by a young corporate vulture and my own treacherous family member. The anger inside me did not explode into a fiery rage. It crystallized into something cold, sharp, and highly focused. "Understood," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I will let the floor manager know you will be handling the crisis personally." I reached down to the main server tower beneath my desk. Plugged into the primary port was a small, heavy-duty encrypted USB drive. It contained the proprietary base code that stabilized the entire network. It was code I had written on my own time on my own equipment and patented under my own name because the company had refused to pay for the system upgrade 5 years ago. They had been using my personal intellectual property for free simply because I cared about the plant running smoothly. If I was no longer an employee, they no longer had the right to use my property. I wrapped my fingers around the metal casing of the drive and pulled it out. The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. The flashing red screens on my terminal froze, then snapped to pitch black. The deep, heavy hum of the massive servers died out, leaving a haunting, unnatural silence in its wake. The emergency backup generators kicked in a second later, bathing the room in dim emergency lighting, but it was too late for the production line. Through the thick glass walls of the server room, I watched the robotic assembly arms grind to a brutal, permanent halt. The factory was dead. The young engineers in the room stopped running and stared at the dark screens in absolute horror. One of them, a kid who had just started last month, looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Mr.
Rollins," he stammered. "What did you do?" "The entire grid just collapsed. The safety protocols are gone." I calmly closed my laptop, slid it into my worn leather briefcase, and stood up. I straightened my tie, looking around the room one last time. "I did exactly what I was told," I replied smoothly. "I am making room for the younger generation. Good luck." I walked out the glass doors, the silence of the paralyzed factory feeling heavier and more profound than any siren. The drive home was quiet, at least inside my car. My phone sitting on the passenger seat was a completely different story. It started buzzing before I even cleared the company parking lot. I glanced at the screen. It was Carter. I ignored it. 2 minutes later, it rang again. The floor manager. Ignored. Then the head of security. Then Carter again. They were realizing that the automated systems Carter praised so highly were entirely dependent on the code I had just taken with me. They were watching hundreds of thousands of dollars evaporate into thin air with every passing minute, and they had absolutely no clue how to turn the lights back on. I let the phone vibrate, feeling a deep, satisfying calm wash over me. They wanted me gone, and now they had to live with the reality of my absence. I pulled into the driveway of my home. It was a beautiful, spacious house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the house I had paid for in cash, the house I allowed my daughter Tasha and her husband Bradley to live in, rent-free, so they could build their future. I gathered my briefcase, feeling the weight of the USB drive tucked safely inside, and walked up the front steps. I unlocked the door, expecting the house to be empty or perhaps quiet as they usually worked late. Instead, I heard the distinct sharp pop of a cork, followed by the fizz of expensive champagne. I walked quietly down the hallway and stopped at the entrance to the living room. There stood Bradley, still wearing his tailored designer suit, holding a crystal glass in one hand and a bottle of vintage champagne in the other. He was pacing the floor, his phone pressed to his ear, laughing with a reckless, triumphant joy. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing right behind him in the doorway. "That is right," Bradley said into his phone, a smug grin plastered across his face. "I just got the text from Carter. He finally did it. He fired the old man. I told you Carter getting rid of him frees up a massive chunk of the IT budget for my department. Now I can finally take control of the software contracts. We just needed to push the dinosaur out to pasture." Bradley took a large sip of his champagne, celebrating the destruction of my career in the very house my money had bought. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the old man. But he had no idea that the factory was currently burning to the ground, and he had no idea that I was standing right there, listening to every single word. I remained perfectly still in the shadowed hallway, letting the heavy oak door conceal my presence. Bradley was pacing the length of the living room, his leather shoes clicking against the pristine hardwood floors. He brought the crystal flute to his lips, taking a long, arrogant sip of the vintage champagne before speaking back into his phone. "Carter, I have to hand it to you," Bradley said, his voice dripping with a smug, self-satisfied victory. "You played the board of directors perfectly. They bought the entire restructuring narrative without a single question. With the old man finally out of the picture, we can reallocate his massive IT maintenance budget directly into the new software contracts. Yes, exactly. The contracts my buddy is bidding on. We just shaved millions off the operational costs by cutting that dinosaur loose. He laughed, a harsh grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. No, he did not even put up a fight. He just packed up his little briefcase and walked out. Good riddance. He was always holding us back, acting like his outdated systems were some kind of untouchable holy grail. Now I am in complete control of the financial allocations for the entire tech division. We won Carter. I stood there listening to the man who slept under my roof brag about dismantling my 4 decades of hard work. The sheer venom in his voice was not just professional, it was deeply personal. He was reveling in my perceived defeat, assuming I was nothing more than a frail old man retreating into quiet obsolescence. As I watched his pale skin flush with the thrill of his treacherous victory, a profound icy rage began to crystallize in my veins. I looked around the expansive living room, taking in the vaulted ceilings, the custom mahogany furniture, the imported rugs. This was not his house. I bought this property in cash 5 years ago. I handed over the keys to my daughter Tasha so she and her new husband could start their lives without the crushing weight of a mortgage. Bradley walked around acting like the king of the castle, but he was nothing more than a squatter in a fortress built entirely by my labor. My mind flashed back to a rainy Tuesday exactly 3 years ago. Bradley had come to my private office, his face pale, his hands shaking, completely stripped of his usual arrogance. He had made a series of disastrous, highly leveraged investments and racked up a mountain of hidden gambling debts. He was days away from federal indictment and total bankruptcy, a scandal that would have destroyed my daughter's life. He sat in my chair and wept like a child begging for salvation. I did not lecture him. I did not humiliate him. I simply opened my desk drawer, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote a cashier's check for $150,000. I handed it to him with one single condition. I told him he must never put Tasha in that position again and that he must honor the family name. I paid his debts, saved his career, and preserved his reputation. I bought the very ground he was currently pacing on. And this was my return on investment. The ultimate betrayal orchestrated by a mediocre financial officer who owed his entire existence to the man he had just conspired to destroy. He thought my silence when Carter fired me was submission. He did not realize it was the silence of a predator locking onto its prey. I had given this man the world, and he had chosen to spit in my face. I stepped out of the shadows and walked onto the hardwood floor. My footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Bradley spun around his phone, still pressed to his ear. The triumphant smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a fleeting flash of guilt before his default arrogance returned. He quickly ended the call and lowered the phone. "Dexter," he said, trying to force a casual tone. "You are home early." I did not say a word. I walked directly up to him, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his face. Before he could react, I raised my hand and swiftly swatted the crystal flute from his grasp. The glass flew across the room, shattering violently against the custom-painted wall. The expensive champagne sprayed across the floor, leaving a dark, dripping stain. Bradley jumped back, his eyes wide with shock and sudden anger. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, his face turning crimson. "Are you insane?" I heard every word. "Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously low and steady. "You and Carter conspired to push me out. You manipulated the board to steal the IT budget for your own kickbacks." Bradley straightened his designer jacket, his shock quickly morphing into brazen defiance. "It is just business, Dexter. You are too old, too stubborn, and way too expensive. The company needs to evolve, and you were standing in the way. You should be thanking me for forcing you into a peaceful retirement. Your archaic methods were bleeding us dry." Before I could respond, rapid footsteps echoed on the staircase. Tasha hurried down into the living room, her eyes darting from the shattered glass on the floor to my face. "Dad, what is going on down here?" she demanded. "Your husband just admitted to orchestrating my termination to steal my departmental budget," I told her, expecting to see shock or outrage on her face. Instead, Tasha crossed her arms, let out a long, exasperated sigh, and stepped directly to Bradley's side, placing a supportive hand on his arm. "Bradley told me this might happen," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Honestly, Dad, you need to know when to bow out gracefully. You are almost 70 years old. You have been holding up Bradley's promotions for years with your stubbornness and your refusal to adapt. It is time for you to know your place, step aside, and let him take the lead."
I stared at my own flesh and blood, the daughter I had sacrificed everything for, defending the parasite who had just stabbed me in the back. As Tasha finished her lecture on how I needed to accept my obsolescence, a sharp, frantic buzzing interrupted the tense silence. Bradley's phone was vibrating violently on the glass coffee table. The caller ID flashed Carter's name in bright, urgent letters. Bradley picked it up, an arrogant smirk returning to his lips. He clearly expected Carter to be calling with a congratulatory update on my departure. To prove his dominance in front of Tasha, he hit the speaker button. Instead of a celebration, Carter's voice tore through the room, high-pitched, breathless, and absolutely hysterical. Bradley, the factory is dead. The core servers are completely locked out. The robotic assembly arms have ground to a halt and the cooling systems are failing. We are bleeding $100,000 every single hour, and the emergency override requires a proprietary encryption key we do not have. The entire system is collapsing. Where the hell is Rollins? The color instantly drained from Bradley's face. His smugness vanished, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He slowly lowered the phone, his hands trembling violently as his eyes darted from the glowing screen to my face. The champagne suddenly did not seem so sweet. I simply stood there in the center of the room I had paid for, adjusted my cuffs, and offered my treacherous son-in-law the coldest, most unforgiving smile he would ever see in his life. Carter's panicked breathing echoed through the phone speaker, filling the tense, heavy silence of the living room. Bradley remained completely frozen, the color fully drained from his face as he stared at me in absolute horror. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the glass coffee table and leaned over the phone. "Carter," I said, my voice as calm as a placid lake. "This is Dexter." The frantic background noise of blaring alarms on the other end stopped for a fraction of a second before Carter's voice cracked with raw, unadulterated desperation. "Dexter, thank God. Listen to me, you need to get back to the plant right now. The thermal regulators are completely failing. The automated systems you took offline are causing a catastrophic cascade across the entire grid. We are losing $100,000 an hour, and the board of directors is going to have my head on a spike if this facility melts down. I am begging you, please just come back and plug your drive into the server. We will double your contractor rate. We will triple it. Just get here and fix this mess immediately." I stood up straight, looking directly into Bradley's terrified eyes as I addressed the groveling executive on the phone. "Carter," I replied smoothly, "the board is restructuring. You are modernizing your workforce and pivoting to automated intelligence. You no longer require the services of an outdated contractor. I highly suggest you let the younger generation take the wheel and fix the thermal regulators themselves. I am officially terminated, remember." I reached down and tapped the red button on the screen, cutting off Carter's pathetic, high-pitched protests instantly. The silence returned to the living room, suffocating and absolute. The realization of his complete and utter failure finally shattered Bradley's paralysis. The sheer terror in his eyes rapidly morphed into a wild, unhinged fury. His breathing turned ragged, his chest heaving under his tailored suit as the magnitude of his disastrous miscalculations set in. He knew exactly what this meant. If the factory suffered a multi-million-dollar loss, on the exact same day he orchestrated the termination of the only engineer who understood the core system, the board of directors would not just fire him. They would utterly destroy his career, strip him of his stock options, and likely pursue him for gross negligence. His entire master plan to redirect the IT budget to his corrupt buddies had just gone up in flames. "You arrogant old fool," Bradley screamed, the veins in his neck bulging as he took a threatening step toward me. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? You are destroying my career. If that plant goes down, the board will demand an immediate investigation. They will look into the budget reallocations I just approved. You need to give me that drive right now." He thrust out his trembling hand, demanding the proprietary code I had spent years writing. I did not move an inch. I looked at his outstretched hand with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You destroyed your own career, Bradley. You played a corporate game of chess without understanding a single piece on the board. You thought you could strip me of my livelihood and steal my budget to cover your shady software deals. Now you get to explain to the shareholders why their flagship manufacturing plant is a smoking crater. I am not lifting a single finger to save you." Bradley's face twisted into a mask of pure malice. He dropped all pretense of being the sophisticated financial officer. He was a cornered rat, desperate and highly dangerous. He lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of my jacket, his breath hot and reeking of expensive champagne. "You are going to go back to that plant, Dexter. You are going to fix the servers, and then you are going to hand over the source code to me. If you do not, I promise I will make the rest of your pathetic life a living hell." I easily shoved him backward, my strength surprising him as he stumbled against the sofa. You have no leverage, Bradley. You have absolutely nothing. Bradley caught his balance and let out a dark, breathless chuckle. A manic gleam appeared in his eyes as he straightened his ruined jacket. No leverage. He repeated, his voice dripping with a newfound sinister confidence. That is where you are completely wrong, Dexter. You think you are the only one who plans ahead. He walked over to his leather briefcase, resting on the armchair, snapped open the brass latches, and pulled out a crisp manila folder. He extracted a single notarized document and held it up like a loaded weapon. I narrowed my eyes, scanning the bold text at the top of the page. It was a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. At the bottom was my signature, or at least a near-perfect forgery of it. "What is this garbage?" I demanded, my voice cold and hard. "It is your surrender," Bradley sneered, waving the paper in the air. "Do you remember when you had that minor knee procedure 2 months ago? You were heavily medicated, barely conscious, signing standard hospital release forms. I simply slipped this little document into the stack. You gave me complete, uncontested control over your medical decisions and your financial estate in the event of cognitive decline. You forged a legal document to steal my autonomy." I stated, the sheer depravity of his actions fully coming into focus. "I did not forge anything." He shot back, a wicked smile spreading across his face. "You signed it with your own hand. And considering your recent erratic behavior, sabotaging a multi-million-dollar facility, displaying severe paranoia, and acting out violently against your own family, I would say your cognitive decline is undeniable." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a vicious, deadly whisper. "Here is exactly what is going to happen, Dexter. You are going to hand over that USB drive right now, and you are going to transfer the rights to that proprietary code over to my department. If you refuse, I will execute this document tonight. I will freeze every single bank account you have. I will have a doctor declare you mentally unfit, and I will lock you inside a state-run psychiatric ward so fast your head will spin. You will spend the rest of your miserable life eating pureed food and staring at a padded wall while I take control of your house and spend your money." The room went dead silent. I turned my gaze slowly toward my daughter. Tasha was standing perfectly still near the staircase. I looked deeply into her eyes, searching for a single shred of the girl I had raised, waiting for her to scream at her husband, to tear the forged document from his hands and defend her own father from this monstrous threat. I waited for her to show any sign of humanity. Instead, Tasha swallowed hard, crossed her arms tighter, and deliberately averted her eyes. She looked down at the hardwood floor, choosing the comfort of her luxurious life over the freedom and sanity of the man who had given her absolutely everything. Her silence was the most deafening sound I had ever heard. It was absolute complicity. The betrayal was complete. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply adjusted my grip on my briefcase, turned my back on the 2 parasites standing in my home, and walked toward the front door. The time for words was over. As I stepped out into the cool evening air and closed the heavy oak door behind me, I felt a dangerous, unyielding focus take over my mind. They wanted a war. I was going to give them an execution. The crisp morning air did little to cool the sharp, unrelenting focus in my mind. I had spent the night in a luxury downtown hotel, having left my own house to the scavengers who currently occupied it. At 7 in the morning, I walked into my usual upscale cafe, the smell of roasted coffee beans providing a brief familiar comfort. I approached the polished marble counter, ordered a simple black espresso, and handed the young barista my premium platinum credit card. She swiped it through the terminal with practiced ease. The machine immediately beeped a harsh, dissonant tone. She frowned, muttered a quick apology, and tried the swipe again. The exact same red error message flashed across her digital screen. "I am sorry, Mr. Rollins," she said, her voice laced with genuine confusion. "The system is saying your card is completely restricted. It is declining the transaction." I did not blink. I did not display a single ounce of surprise. I stepped aside, pulled my phone from my tailored jacket pocket, and dialed the private client hotline for my banking institution. The representative who answered sounded tense, almost apologetic. She verified my identity through a series of security questions and then delivered the news I fully expected to hear. "Mr. Rollins, a total emergency freeze was placed on your primary checking and savings accounts late last night. We received a notarized medical power of attorney from a Mr. Bradley invoking immediate guardianship protocols." He cited severe cognitive decline and erratic financial behavior as the primary reasons for the freeze. He has successfully locked down all authorized access to your liquid funds." Bradley had moved with the desperate, frantic speed of a cornered animal. He truly believed he had cut off my air supply. He thought he could starve me out in the cold, forcing me into a position of total submission until I came crawling back to my own house with the encrypted drive in my hand, begging for my allowance. I thanked the bank representative for her time, ended the call, and pulled a crisp $100 bill from my silver money clip. I handed it to the barista, told her to keep the change, and took my espresso. I did not feel a single drop of panic. I took a slow, calculated sip of the dark, bitter coffee. Bradley had fired his first shot, and it was pathetically weak. The game was officially set. An hour later, I walked through the towering heavy glass doors of the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the city. I did not look like a senile, defeated old man wandering aimlessly through the final, pathetic chapters of his life. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a perfectly pressed white shirt, and a dark silk tie. I projected the absolute, unyielding authority of a man who commanded respect the second he entered a room. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps measured and heavy with purpose. The front desk receptionist recognized me instantly, offering a polite, deferential nod before immediately escorting me down the long, mahogany-paneled corridor. She bypassed the waiting area entirely and opened the heavy double doors at the end of the hall, revealing the expansive, meticulously organized corner office of Martin Thorne. Martin was a predator in a tailored suit. He was a brilliant, merciless legal mind who had spent the last 3 decades tearing apart massive corporate conglomerates and dismantling hostile takeovers with surgical precision. We had been close friends and trusted associates for over 20 years. He looked up from his massive oak desk, taking in my sharp attire and the rigid, unforgiving set of my jaw. He set his expensive fountain pen down and leaned back in his plush leather chair. "You have the distinct look of a man who is about to end an empire," Martin said, a knowing, dangerous smirk playing on his lips. "Who exactly do we need to destroy today?" I sat down in the leather guest chair opposite him, placing my worn leather briefcase squarely on the center of his desk. I laid out the events of the previous 24 hours with cold, clinical precision. I told him about Carter firing me to steal the IT budget for his own vanity projects. I explained the catastrophic factory shutdown that followed. I detailed the confrontation in my living room, explaining how Bradley dragged out a forged power of attorney, threatening to lock me inside a psychiatric ward while my own daughter stood in complete cowardly silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of panic, sorrow, or grief. I spoke with the chilling, calculated calm of an apex predator, lining up a final kill shot. Martin listened intently, his fingers steepled together beneath his chin, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed the sheer, staggering audacity of Bradley and Carter. When I finished my recounting, the grand office was dead silent. A lesser lawyer would have expressed sympathy or performative outrage. Martin simply let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated with malicious intent. "They really have no idea who they just picked a fight with, do they?" Martin asked softly. I shook my head, a grim, humorless smile finally breaking across my face. "They think they have me completely cornered," I replied, my voice hard. "Bradley executed his fake medical directive late last night. He froze my primary checking and savings accounts. He thinks he cut off my financial lifeblood and left me destitute." Martin laughed out loud this time, shaking his head in absolute disbelief as he pulled up my extensive financial portfolio on his secure computer terminal. "He froze the decoy accounts," Martin said, his voice dripping with mockery. "He froze the basic accounts you use to buy groceries, fill your gas tank, and pay the monthly electric bill. He thinks he just won the lottery by freezing a few $1,000s. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of his polished desk. Exactly. Bradley is a mediocre financial officer who only understands what is placed right in front of his face. He has absolutely no idea that 90% of my actual wealth, the vast real estate portfolios, the aggressive mutual funds, the shell corporations, and the massive liquid assets are locked tight inside the irrevocable blind trust we established a decade ago. His little forged piece of paper has absolutely zero jurisdiction over the trust. The bank will laugh in his face if he tries to touch it. I am financially bulletproof." Martin nodded, tapping his pen against the desk in a rhythmic, predatory beat. "We can bury him for federal document fraud whenever we decide the time is right. But what about the factory Dexter? You pulled the core system bypass, The board of directors is going to come after you with everything they have in their legal arsenal. They will claim you stole vital company property and committed gross corporate sabotage to leverage your job back. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy-duty encrypted USB drive. I placed it on the desk, right between us, the metal casing catching the overhead light. They can claim whatever they want, Martin, but they have a massive, fatal legal blind spot. I did not steal company property. 5 years ago, when the previous board of directors refused to fund the necessary software upgrade because they thought it was too expensive, I wrote that core automation matrix on my own time inside my own house using my own personal equipment. And what exactly did we do with that specific code immediately after I finished writing it? Martin smiled broadly, fully revealing his teeth. We filed a comprehensive software patent under your personal name, he stated, pulling up the Federal Legal Registry on his screen to confirm. The company never bought the license from you. You were letting them use your highly valuable intellectual property for free out of the goodness of your heart to keep the line running. I nodded slowly, holding his gaze. And the exact moment Carter terminated my employment, my generosity officially expired. Taking my own property with me is not sabotage. It is legally protecting my personal assets. Any unauthorized attempt they make to bypass my encryption or restart that factory without my explicit permission is a direct, actionable violation of federal copyright law. Martin stared at the encrypted drive sitting on his desk, fully grasping the sheer, devastating magnitude of the trap I had laid. We had them completely boxed in from every single angle. Bradley was looking at decades in federal prison for fraud, and the company was entirely paralyzed by their own arrogant incompetence. We are going to bleed them absolutely dry, Martin said softly, his eyes scanning the room as he already began mentally drafting the brutal legal briefs. Before I could respond to his statement, a sharp, urgent knock echoed loudly on the heavy office door. Martin stopped and called out for them to enter. His administrative assistant stepped nervously into the room. She was accompanied by a tall, stern-looking man wearing a cheap suit and holding a thick, sealed manila envelope. The man bypassed the assistant entirely, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto me. He walked directly up to my chair. Dexter Rollins. The man asked, his tone flat and professional. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket, and nodded. Yes. The man shoved the heavy envelope directly against my chest, forcing me to take it. You have been officially served, he said coldly. He turned on his heel and walked straight out of the office without another word. I sat back down, my expression unchanged. I tore the thick seal off the envelope and pulled out a massive bound stack of legal documents. I flipped to the summary page, my eyes scanning the aggressive corporate letterhead from the company's elite legal team. Martin watched me closely from across the desk, the predatory amusement vanishing from his face. What is it? He asked, his tone shifting into business mode. I tossed the thick legal packet onto the desk, letting it land right next to my proprietary USB drive. It is a massive lawsuit from Carter and the entire board of directors, I said, my voice hardening into impenetrable steel. They are officially suing me for $5 million, accusing me of gross corporate sabotage and domestic terrorism. 72 hours later, I walked into the expansive glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of the corporate headquarters. The preliminary mediation hearing had been hastily demanded by the company to address their $5 million lawsuit against me. I wore the same bespoke charcoal suit projecting absolute authority. Martin walked right beside me, holding a single slim leather portfolio. As we entered the room, the scent of expensive cologne and misplaced arrogance was suffocating. Sitting across the massive polished mahogany table were Carter and Bradley, flanked by 3 highly paid corporate litigators in pristine suits. Carter sat at the center, leaning back in his plush leather chair with a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. Bradley sat to his right, looking incredibly confident, clearly believing that dropping a massive career-ending lawsuit on a retired engineer had terrified me into absolute submission. They thought the mere threat of a $5 million penalty would break me. Carter did not even offer a greeting. He simply slid a thick bound document across the polished wood toward my side of the table. Dexter Carter began, his voice dripping with that same unearned superiority he used on the day he fired me. We are willing to be generous. We know a $5 million judgment will completely bankrupt you. We are prepared to drop the lawsuit, waive the damages for the production loss, and even offer you a small severance package. All you have to do is hand over the encrypted drive sign, this full confession of corporate sabotage, and issue a formal apology to the board. Take the deal, Dexter. You are out of your depth. Bradley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, a venomous grin playing on his lips. You really should sign it, old man, Bradley added, his tone dripping with mock pity. You do not have the resources to fight an army of corporate lawyers. Sign the paper, hand over the code, and maybe I will not execute that medical directive we discussed. It is your only way out. I did not touch the document. I did not even look at it. I simply kept my eyes locked onto Carter, my face a mask of impenetrable stone. I took a slow, deliberate seat, buttoning my jacket, and gave Martin a slight nod. Martin did not sit down. He stepped up to the edge of the mahogany table, looking at the three corporate litigators with the amused expression of a wolf observing a flock of particularly slow sheep. He opened his leather portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. He did not hand them to the opposing lawyers. He tossed them directly onto the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed through the silent boardroom. Gentlemen, Martin said, his voice echoing with absolute authority, my client will not be signing a confession because my client has not committed a single actionable offense. You are suing Dexter Rollins for the sabotage and theft of corporate property. The fatal flaw in your aggressive little lawsuit is that the code in question does not belong to you. It never did. Carter frowned, his smugness faltering for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? He built that system while employed by this company. It is proprietary corporate infrastructure. Martin let out a sharp, mocking laugh. You clearly did not read the operational history of the facility you supposedly run. 5 years ago, my client officially requested funding to upgrade the core automation matrix. The board of directors formally rejected that proposal in writing, citing budget constraints. Recognizing that the factory would eventually face catastrophic failure without an upgrade, my client wrote the new base code entirely on his own time off company property using his own personal hardware. Martin pointed a sharp finger at the documents on the table. That is a federally registered software patent. It is legally owned by Dexter Rollins as a private individual. He generously allowed this company to utilize his intellectual property completely free of charge out of a sense of personal loyalty to the manufacturing crew. However, the exact second you terminated his employment contract, his generosity officially expired. When he pulled that drive, he was not sabotaging your factory. He was lawfully retrieving his own personal property to prevent unauthorized corporate usage. Martin leaned over the table, staring directly into the eyes of the lead corporate litigator. Furthermore, if your internal engineers have made any unauthorized attempts to bypass his encryption, reverse engineer his matrix, or force a system restart using his framework, you are currently in active violation of federal copyright law. We are not just rejecting your ridiculous settlement. We are officially preparing a countersuit for intellectual property theft, unauthorized exploitation of patented technology, and wrongful termination. You do not have a case. You have a massive bleeding liability. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Carter stared at the documents on the table as if they were a live explosive. He reached out with trembling hands and pulled the patent filings toward him. His eyes darted across the pages, reading the bold, undeniable legal text proving my ownership. He looked up at his lead litigator. The lawyer, a man who charged $1,000 an hour, was pale. The lawyer slowly nodded, confirming that Martin was entirely correct. They had built a $5 million lawsuit on a foundation of sand, and Martin had just kicked the supports out. The color completely drained from Carter's face. The smug, untouchable executive was suddenly confronted with the terrifying reality that he had personally fired the sole proprietor of the technology keeping his factory alive. Carter violently threw the documents back onto the table and spun around to face Bradley. "You told me the IT assets were fully audited," Carter screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic and rage. "You are the chief financial officer. You told me we owned the automation infrastructure. You said firing him was a clean break. How the hell did you not know he held a personal patent on the core operating system?" Bradley physically recoiled, sinking into his expensive chair as if trying to merge with the upholstery. He was completely blindsided, stammering and grasping for an excuse. "I did not know," Bradley protested weakly, his voice trembling. "He never mentioned a patent. The system was already integrated when I took over the financials. I assumed it was standard corporate property."
You assumed, Carter roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table so hard the coffee cups rattled. You authorized a massive budget restructuring based on an assumption. The factory has been dark for 3 days. We have lost over $7 million in raw production, and now you are telling me we have absolutely zero legal right to the software we need to turn the lights back on. The alliance between the two arrogant executives crumbled instantly. Carter realized his neck was squarely on the chopping block. The board of directors would not accept excuses. They would look at the man who initiated the firing, and they would look at the financial officer who failed to perform a basic asset audit. Carter was fully prepared to throw Bradley directly under the bus to save his own skin. "You are a complete liability, Bradley." Carter spat, pointing a shaking finger at his supposed partner. "I am going to advise the board to suspend you pending a full investigation into your gross incompetence. You told me we had the leverage. You promised me you had this old man under control." Bradley was sweating profusely. He looked at the furious executive, then looked at the silent, furious lawyers, and finally he looked across the table at me. I sat there with perfect posture, my hands resting calmly on the table, watching him drown in the consequences of his own arrogance. I did not smile, but my eyes conveyed all the satisfaction I needed. Bradley realized that his corporate career was effectively over. His grand plan to redirect the IT budget had resulted in a catastrophic failure that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was trapped in a legal and professional nightmare, and his forged medical power of attorney was absolutely useless in a room full of federal patent lawyers. He was backed into a corner, completely stripped of his unearned power. But as he stared at me, the panic in his eyes began to morph into something highly toxic and incredibly dangerous. He realized he could not beat me in a boardroom. He could not outsmart me with legal threats or corporate maneuvering. I was too prepared, too insulated, and vastly superior in my strategy. If he wanted to break me, he had to completely abandon the professional battlefield and strike at the one thing I could not protect with a patent. Bradley slowly stood up from the table, his breathing ragged, but his gaze locked onto mine with a sickening, malicious intent. He did not say a word to Carter. He ignored the lawyers. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. I watched his thumb swipe across the screen, his eyes burning with a desperate, vengeful fire. He was going to leverage the only weapon he had left in his pathetic arsenal. He was going to use my daughter. He knew that Tasha was my only blind spot, the only person whose pain could force my hand. As he pressed the phone to his ear and turned to walk out of the chaotic boardroom, I knew the real war was about to begin. He was going to brainwash her, manipulate her emotions, and send her straight to my doorstep. I had barely returned to my suite at the downtown luxury hotel when the aggressive, frantic pounding echoed against my heavy wooden door. I knew exactly who it was. Bradley had fired his final, most desperate weapon. I unbolted the lock and pulled the door open. Tasha pushed her way past me into the room, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She did not look like the composed, arrogant woman who had stood in my living room and told me to step aside. She looked like a cornered, frantic child, and she immediately launched into a hysterical, emotionally charged assault. "Dad, what are you doing?" she screamed, her voice cracking as she spun around to face me. "Are you actively trying to destroy my family? Bradley just called me from the office, absolutely devastated. He said you ambushed him with an army of lawyers, that you are threatening to sue the company and bankrupt us both. Why are you being so incredibly selfish? You have your retirement. You have your money. Why are you trying to ruin my husband's career over some petty grudge? You have to stop this right now and give Bradley what he needs to fix the factory. You have to yield to him, Dad, or you are going to completely destroy my marriage." I stood perfectly still, letting her hysterical accusations wash over me. She was using every manipulative tactic in the book, weaponizing her tears, playing the ultimate victim, and trying to inflict as much guilt as she possibly could. She expected me to crumble. She expected the loving, overly generous father to wrap his arms around her, apologize for causing her distress, and hand over the keys to his kingdom just to see her smile again. But that version of her father died the moment she stood by and watched her husband threaten to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a comforting embrace. I walked calmly over to the polished mahogany desk in the corner of the suite, opened my leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, securely bound folder. Martin Thorne possessed an elite team of forensic accountants,
and they had spent the last 48 hours digging deep into the financial underbelly of the corporation. I walked back to the center of the room and dropped the heavy folder directly onto the glass coffee table with a loud, resounding thud. "Stop crying and look at the table," I commanded, my voice devoid of any warmth or paternal softness. Tasha flinched, startled by the sheer unyielding authority in my tone. She wiped her eyes and stared down at the folder. "Open it," I told her. "Read the highlighted documents. Read the bank statements, the offshore wire transfers, and the corresponding dates." She hesitantly reached down and flipped open the cover. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the top page, her brow furrowing in confusion. I did not give her time to process it slowly. I laid out the brutal, undeniable truth. "Your husband did not fire me to modernize the workforce, Tasha. Your husband fired me because he is a desperate, pathetic criminal who has relapsed into his gambling addiction. Look at the numbers. Over the past 8 months, Bradley has systematically embezzled over $2 million from the corporate reserve funds. He has been quietly siphoning company money through dummy vendor accounts to pay off massive aggressive debts to illegal offshore sports books." Tasha's breath hitched in her throat. She gripped the edge of the glass table, her knuckles turning white. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in frantic denial. "Bradley does not gamble anymore. You paid off his debts. He promised me he was done. He lied to you just like he lies to the board of directors," I stated coldly. "The annual corporate financial audit is scheduled for next month." Bradley knew the auditors would immediately find the massive hole he dug in the company reserves. He was terrified of going to federal prison, so he fabricated a restructuring plan. He convinced the chief operating officer to terminate me so he could seize my entire multi-million-dollar IT maintenance budget. He planned to use my departmental funds to quietly plug the hole in the corporate accounts before the auditors arrived, covering his tracks and saving his own skin. He sacrificed my 40-year career to hide his felonies. Tasha stared at the bank statements, the irrefutable evidence of her husband's profound corruption printed in stark black and white. But the cognitive dissonance was too strong. The illusion of her perfect affluent life was cracking, and she desperately refused to let it shatter. She looked up at me, her face twisting from shock into a mask of ugly, irrational anger. "You fabricated this!" she yelled, her voice shaking with rage. "You paid your ruthless lawyers to create fake documents just to ruin him. You have always hated that I married a white man who was smarter and more successful than you. You are just trying to control me by destroying the man I love." I looked at my daughter, feeling a deep, hollow sorrow settle into my chest. I realized in that exact moment that she was completely lost to me. She was so addicted to the status and the luxury that she was willing to defend a parasite over her own flesh and blood. "He does not love you, Tasha." I said, my words slicing through the air like a surgical scalpel. "He has never loved you. He loves the financial shield that I provided. He loves the pristine house I bought for him. He loves the lifestyle my money affords him. He does not love you. He loves the ATM that carries my name. And the second he realizes that the ATM is permanently closed, he will discard you without a second thought." Tasha let out a sharp, breathless gasp as if I had physically struck her. I took a step back, drawing a permanent, invisible boundary between us. "I am giving you one final warning," I told her, my eyes locking onto hers with absolute, chilling finality. "If you walk out that door and go back to him, you are making a permanent choice. You are choosing a fraudulent, abusive criminal over your own father. If you cross that threshold, you are completely on your own. I will cut you out of my life, I will cut you out of my estate, and I will not lift a single finger to help you when the federal agents kick down your front door. Make your choice." Tasha let out a primal scream of frustration. In a fit of blinding, irrational denial, she grabbed the stack of forensic bank statements from the table and violently ripped them in half. She tore the papers again and again, throwing the shredded evidence into the air like confetti. "You are a bitter, controlling old man," she spat, her face red with fury. "I choose my husband." She turned on her heel, stormed across the suite, and slammed the heavy wooden door behind her with a force that rattled the picture frames on the walls. I stood alone in the center of the silent room, watching the shredded pieces of paper slowly settle onto the carpet. A profound, heavy grief washed over me. I had officially lost my daughter to her own greed and delusion. But there was no time to mourn. The silence of the suite was suddenly shattered by a harsh, pulsating alarm coming from my smartphone resting on the desk. It was not a standard ringtone. It was a highly specialized, encrypted alert system I had built years ago. I walked over and picked up the device. The screen was flashing a bright, urgent crimson red. Warning: unauthorized bypass attempt detected. Brute force decryption sequence initiated on localized servers. I stared at the flashing alert, a dark, dangerous smile slowly forming on my face. Bradley was completely unhinged. Knowing he had lost the legal battle and failed to manipulate me through Tasha, he had crossed the final fatal line. He had bypassed standard company protocols and illegally hired a black hat hacker to breach my proprietary source code. The corporate dispute was over. The digital war had just begun, and Bradley had absolutely no idea about the lethal defensive countermeasures I had baked into that system. I sat perfectly still at the polished mahogany desk in my hotel suite, watching the digital battlefield unfold on my secure monitor. The red warning banners multiplied across the screen, painting the dark room in a harsh, pulsing crimson glow. Bradley had actually done it. In a final act of unhinged desperation, he had completely bypassed internal company security protocols and hired a mercenary black hat hacker to infiltrate the manufacturing plant's core network. They were attempting a massive brute force attack, trying to smash their way into my proprietary code to manually override the system lockdown. What the amateur hacker and my treacherous son-in-law did not understand was that I had spent 40 years anticipating every possible vulnerability. My encryption was not a simple digital wall they could knock down. It was a complex labyrinth of active, highly aggressive countermeasures. I watched the live diagnostic feed as the hacker blindly triggered my primary security honeypot. The intrusion software was instantly trapped in a recursive digital feedback loop. It completely isolated their external commands while simultaneously maxing out the thermal load on the facility's secondary physical servers. At the factory miles away, those massive secondary processors were currently spinning out of control, generating extreme volatile heat without triggering the safety cooling fans. Within 3 minutes, the telemetry data on my screen spiked violently, followed immediately by a total signal loss from the secondary array. The hacker had literally fried the physical hardware. $2 million worth of custom high-end servers had just melted into useless slag metal right inside the company headquarters. I took a slow, calm sip of my dark coffee. The financial hemorrhage at the plant had just escalated from a massive operational crisis to a catastrophic physical disaster. Less than 30 seconds after the secondary servers melted down, my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed a private corporate number I had not seen in years. It was the chief executive officer. I answered the call and placed the phone flat on the desk, activating the speaker. Dexter, the CEO, began, his voice dripping with that polished artificial warmth specifically reserved for corporate negotiations. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. I want to personally apologize for the unfortunate misunderstanding with Carter and the board of directors. Middle management always jumps the gun, and they clearly failed to recognize your immense historical value to this company. But we are all reasonable men here. We can fix this quietly and amicably before the shareholders panic and the stock price plummets. He paused clearly, waiting for me to express profound gratitude for his benevolent intervention. I remained completely silent, letting the heavy quiet stretch out. The CEO cleared his throat, his fake warmth slipping just a fraction as his impatience grew. "Look, I understand you are upset about how your exit was handled," he continued, adopting a patronizing, fatherly tone. "But you have successfully made your point. The factory is at a complete standstill, and I just received a highly disturbing report that we suffered a severe hardware malfunction in the server room due to your encryption lockout. We are bleeding money rapidly. I am willing to step in as a neutral party and offer you a very generous golden parachute. We will cut you a check for $500,000 right now to purchase the full exclusive rights to your software patent. $500,000, Dexter. That is a massive windfall for a retired engineer. You sign the transfer papers today, we drop our $5 million lawsuit against you, and you get to walk away a very wealthy man without spending the rest of your life buried in exhausting legal fees." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound echoed off the hotel walls, cold and entirely devoid of any amusement. "You really think I am that mathematically illiterate?" I replied, leaning closer to the phone so he could hear the absolute steel in my voice. "Your automated factory has been completely offline for days. You have lost over $7 million in raw production, and your newly appointed chief financial officer just hired an illegal hacker who melted $2 million worth of secondary server hardware trying to steal my intellectual property. You are staring down the barrel of a $10 million deficit this week alone, And you are offering me a measly $500,000 to make your bleeding stop. That is not a golden parachute. That is a cheap, insulting bandage for an arterial wound. Keep your $500,000. I do not want it." The CEO lost his diplomatic facade instantly. "Listen to me very carefully, Rollins," he snapped, his voice dropping into a harsh, vicious growl. "You are playing an incredibly dangerous game. You think your little patent makes you untouchable, but we have the capital and the corporate backing to drag this litigation out for a decade. We will freeze you in federal court until you are completely bankrupt. You will not see a single dime, and you will die penniless and disgraced. I do not negotiate over the phone with desperate, incompetent men," I said, my voice cutting through his empty corporate threats like a razor. "You have absolutely no leverage left. Your flagship factory is a graveyard. Your operations team is a complete joke. And your chief financial officer is a criminal liability who has been quietly draining your corporate reserve funds to pay off his illegal gambling debts for the past 8 months. If you want to save your company from total financial liquidation, we will do this entirely on my terms." I paused, letting the crushing, terrifying weight of my words settle over him. "I will be at the corporate headquarters on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I want the entire board of directors sitting at the main conference table. I want all of your elite legal counsel present. And most importantly, I want Carter and Bradley sitting in those chairs. If either of them is missing, or if you attempt any more childish legal intimidation tactics, I will walk out the door, delete the decryption keys permanently, and let your manufacturing plant rot until the bank repossesses the building. Have I made myself perfectly clear?" The CEO breathed heavily into the receiver. He knew he was trapped. He knew his entire corporate empire was resting entirely in the palms of my hands, and that I was holding all the cards. "We will be there," he finally muttered, the bitter taste of absolute defeat heavy in his voice. 8 o'clock. Do not be late." I ended the call and let the silence return to the room. I had them exactly where I wanted them. The board was ready to break. Carter was finished, and Bradley was officially out of time. Just as I stood up to review my final legal strategy with Martin, my phone chimed with a secure encrypted text message. It was an urgent alert from Martin's forensic investigation team. I opened the message and read the brief, highly alarming report. Bradley was making a final frantic move. He knew the upcoming corporate audit would publicly expose his massive embezzlement. He knew his illegal hacker had failed miserably, and he knew Monday morning would be his professional execution. With his corporate life over and no options left, he was trying to secure a getaway fund. The report showed that Bradley was currently filing expedited fraudulent paperwork with a predatory real estate firm. He was attempting to execute a rapid cash sale on the suburban house he and Tasha lived in. He was forging my signature to liquidate my property, planning to steal the equity, abandon my daughter with nothing, and flee the country before the federal authorities could arrest him. I pocketed my phone, a lethal, unyielding calm washing over me. Bradley thought he could run, but I was about to slam the final trap shut right on his fingers. The cramped, dimly lit office of the expedited real estate broker smelled of cheap, stale coffee, old paper, and sheer desperation. It was a far cry from the pristine, climate-controlled glass towers Bradley was accustomed to inhabiting. But when you are attempting to illegally liquidate a multi-million-dollar suburban estate in under 24 hours to fund a federal flight risk, you do not get the luxury of being picky. Bradley sat perched on the edge of a scuffed vinyl chair, his leg bouncing with a frantic, uncontrollable nervous energy. His normally immaculate designer suit was severely wrinkled, and his expensive silk tie hung loosely around his collar. He was sweating profusely, frequently pulling a handkerchief to wipe his pale forehead as he leaned aggressively over the broker's cluttered desk. "Just stamp the documents and authorize the wire transfer." Bradley snapped, his voice tight with raw panic. He checked his luxury wristwatch for the 4th time in 2 minutes. "We agreed on a 20% commission for the expedited cash buyout. The signature is right there on the bottom line. The deed is completely clear. Just push the funds through to the offshore routing number I provided, and we are done." The broker, a sleazy opportunist who made his living bottom-feeding on distressed assets, adjusted his glasses and looked down at the forged power of attorney. He hesitated, his eyes lingering on the bold signature I had supposedly written. "I am moving as fast as I can, Mr. Bradley," the broker muttered, picking up his heavy brass notary stamp. But a same-day cash liquidation of a luxury estate without the primary owner present raises massive red flags. "I just need to verify the medical directive one more time." "Do not verify anything," Bradley hissed, slamming his open palm onto the desk. He is an incapacitated, senile old man, and I am his legally appointed guardian. The paperwork is ironclad. Stamp it right now, or I will take my business to someone who actually wants to make $100,000 today." The broker sighed, blinded by the promise of the massive commission, and raised his heavy metal stamp over the fraudulent contract. Before the rubber stamp could even touch the paper, the frosted glass door of the office was kicked open with such tremendous force that it slammed violently against the drywall, cracking the plaster. I walked into the cramped room, my posture perfectly straight, my presence immediately suffocating the stale air. Martin Thorne stepped in right beside me, his tailored suit cutting a sharp, lethal contrast to the dingy surroundings. He carried his sleek leather briefcase like an executioner holding a loaded weapon. The broker jumped, dropping his notary stamp onto the floor with a loud clatter. Bradley spun around in his vinyl chair, his face instantly draining of all color. The sheer terror in his eyes was absolute and undeniable. He looked like a ghost who had just been handed an eviction notice. "What is this?" the broker stammered, scrambling to gather the scattered documents from his desk. "Who are you people? I am Martin Thorne, senior partner at Thorne & Associates." Martin announced, his voice vibrating with lethal, uncompromising authority. He did not look at Bradley. He walked directly to the broker's desk and dropped a thick, officially sealed court document right on top of the forged deed. "That is an emergency federal injunction and a total asset freeze mandated by a federal judge. The property you are currently attempting to purchase is the sole exclusive asset of my client, Dexter Rollins. The man sitting across from you is a desperate criminal attempting to execute a fraudulent conveyance using forged medical directives. If you stamp that paper, you will be named as a primary co-conspirator in a federal grand jury indictment for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny." The broker practically threw his chair backwards, scrambling away from the desk as if the documents had suddenly caught fire. He raised his hands in immediate panicked surrender. "I have absolutely nothing to do with this," the broker shouted, looking terrified. "He told me he had full legal guardianship. I have not stamped anything. I am out of this deal." The man grabbed his coat and practically sprinted out of his own office, leaving the door wide open. Bradley was left sitting entirely alone, completely exposed and utterly ruined. His ultimate getaway fund had vanished into thin air. He stared at the federal injunction sitting on the desk, his breathing ragged and shallow. He was trapped. The walls were closing in rapidly, and he had absolutely nowhere left to run. I looked down at the pathetic, trembling man who had tried to steal my entire life's work. "It is over, Bradley," I said, my voice cold and devoid of any remaining pity. "The corporate audit found your missing millions this morning. The hacker you hired completely destroyed company property and triggered a federal cybercrime investigation. And now you are caught red-handed committing real estate fraud. You are going to prison for a very long time." The crushing weight of his absolute defeat finally broke his fragile, arrogant mind. The sophisticated, polished financial executive vanished, replaced entirely by a vicious, hateful creature backed into a lethal corner. Bradley leaped to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly rage. He kicked the vinyl chair aside, his chest heaving as he glared at me with a profound, deeply ingrained hatred. He felt intensely humiliated that he had been completely outsmarted and dismantled by me, and his toxic superiority complex violently fractured. "You arrogant old fool," Bradley screamed, the veins bulging in his neck, the spittle flying from his lips. "You think you are so brilliant. You think you are a king because you wrote some pathetic code and saved some money. You are nothing. You are just an old, stubborn black man who does not know his place. You should have been on your knees thanking me for letting you be a part of my family's elevation. I am the face of that company. I am the pedigree. People like me are born to run those executive boardrooms, and people like you are supposed to stay down in the engine room where you belong." He paced the small room, pointing an accusatory, shaking finger at my face. "I deserved that house. I deserved that money. It made me sick to my stomach every single day. I had to sit at your dining table and pretend to respect you. I had to pretend that taking your charity to pay off my debts was not completely humiliating me. You are a relic. You are a lower-class thug who just got lucky, and I am not going to let an old black dinosaur put me in a cage." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to his vile provocations. I simply watched him unravel, allowing his true, horrific nature to spill out into the open air. He was so consumed by his racist, venomous tirade that he completely failed to notice Martin casually leaning against the desk. Martin held his smartphone resting quietly in the palm of his hand, the red digital recording icon blinking steadily, capturing every single vile, hateful, incriminating word for the federal prosecutor. Bradley finally stopped screaming. His chest was heaving as he gasped for air, his face flushed with a sickening, hateful triumph. He actually thought his vicious words had somehow wounded me, that his racist outburst had somehow reclaimed his shattered dignity in the face of total ruin. I simply looked past his shoulder, my expression entirely calm and resolute. "You are absolutely right, Bradley," I said smoothly. "You did have to pretend for a very long time, but you do not have to pretend anymore." Bradley frowned, confused by my total lack of an emotional reaction. He slowly turned around to follow my gaze. The frosted glass door to the office had been pushed wide open during his unhinged rant. Standing perfectly still in the doorway was Tasha. I had sent her an anonymous text message exactly 30 minutes ago providing this address and instructing her to come immediately if she wanted to see the real man she had married. She had arrived just in time to hear her husband admit to forging documents to steal her childhood home and to hear him hurl the most repulsive racist hatred at the father who had loved and protected her. The color was completely drained from her face. Her eyes were wide with a devastating, earth-shattering horror. Her expensive designer purse slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. The blindfold had finally violently been ripped away. The weekend passed in a blur of shattered illusions for my daughter, but for me, it was a period of absolute cold calculation. When Monday morning arrived, I dressed with the precision of a general preparing for a final siege. I bypassed my usual conservative charcoal suit and opted for a pristine midnight black suit paired with a deep crimson silk tie. It was a subtle, deliberate nod to the financial blood they had tried to draw from me and the massive hemorrhage they were currently suffering. I arrived at the corporate headquarters at exactly 7:55 in the morning. Martin Thorne walked perfectly in step beside me, carrying a reinforced leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of two highly arrogant executives. As we strode through the grand marble lobby, the few employees who recognized me stopped and stared, whispering in hushed, nervous tones. They knew the factory was dead, and they knew I was the man who had pulled the plug. We did not wait for the receptionist to announce us. We walked directly to the private executive elevator and took it to the top floor. The heavy glass doors of the primary boardroom swung open, revealing an atmosphere that was thick, suffocating, and reeking of sheer panic. The entire board of directors was already seated around the massive, polished mahogany table. At the far end sat the chief executive officer, his face drawn pale and deeply tense. To his right sat Carter, the young chief operating officer who had foolishly initiated this entire catastrophe. Carter was sweating profusely, his hands nervously shuffling a stack of completely useless operational reports. And seated directly across from him was Bradley. My son-in-law looked like a dead man walking. The unhinged racist bravado he had displayed in the real estate office was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man who knew his execution was imminent. I walked to the head of the table, pulling out the only empty leather chair, and sat down with slow, commanding authority. The king had officially returned to his castle. The chief executive officer cleared his throat, desperately attempting to seize control of a room that no longer belonged to him. He forced a diplomatic, deeply uncomfortable smile and reached into his inner breast pocket. "Dexter, we are all professionals here." The CEO began, his voice lacking its usual booming, intimidating confidence. "The events of the past week have been highly regrettable and mistakes were clearly made in middle management, but we are prepared to make this right today. The board has convened an emergency session over the weekend and authorized an unprecedented, highly lucrative settlement." He slid a crisp, certified corporate check across the polished mahogany table. It glided over the wood and came to a stop directly in front of me. The bold numbers printed across the center read $5 million. "It is a full, unconditional buyout of your software patent." The CEO continued, puffing out his chest to try and project strength. "You walk away an incredibly wealthy man. The factory goes back online this morning, and we all put this ugly chapter behind us immediately. Take the check, Dexter." I looked down at the piece of paper. $5 million was a staggering amount of money, a sum that would force almost any rational man to capitulate. I reached out with my index finger and slowly, deliberately pushed the check back across the table. It slid until it bumped against the CEO's folded hands. "I am not here for a settlement," I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling metallic finality. "I am here for a reckoning." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a small, sleek digital audio recorder. I placed it perfectly in the center of the table, pressed the volume to its maximum setting, and hit play. The pristine acoustics of the corporate boardroom instantly amplified the recording Martin had captured in the real estate office just 3 days prior. Bradley's unhinged, venomous voice filled the room. The board members stiffened their eyes, widening in shock as they heard their chief financial officer boast about manipulating the executive team, forging legal documents, and plotting to steal a suburban estate to fund a federal flight risk. But the true shockwave hit when the recording shifted to his vile, unfiltered, racist tirade against me. The executives visibly recoiled as Bradley's voice echoed off the glass walls, calling me a lower-class thug, a black dinosaur, and explicitly admitting that his entire corporate persona was a fabricated lie designed to steal my wealth. One female board member dropped her pen in pure disgust. A senior partner adjusted his tie, looking physically sickened. I watched the faces of the board members twist in absolute horror and revulsion. Bradley sank lower into his expensive chair, covering his face with his trembling hands, entirely unable to look anyone in the eye. The recording ended with a sharp, definitive click, leaving a toxic, deafening silence in its wake. Martin Thorne did not give the board a single second to recover from the audio recording. He stepped forward, unlatched his leather briefcase, and pulled out a massive stack of thick, heavily documented forensic dossiers. He walked around the mahogany table, dropping a heavy copy in front of every single board member. The CEO stared at the cover page, the last remaining color draining from his face. "What you just heard was the sound of a desperate, cornered criminal," Martin announced, his voice slicing through the boardroom like a guillotine. "But blatant racism and monumental arrogance are not why we requested this meeting today. We are here to expose the massive bleeding financial wound your chief financial officer has actively inflicted upon this corporation. Please turn to page 4. The board members scrambled to open the dossiers, the sound of flipping paper filling the tense air. Martin began to narrate the brutal financial reality with surgical precision. Over the past 8 months, Bradley has systematically embezzled exactly $2.4 million from your corporate reserve funds. He utilized a highly sophisticated web of dummy vendor accounts and bypassed dual authentication wire protocols to funnel company capital directly to illegal offshore sports books to cover his massive gambling debts. Gasps of shock erupted around the table. Carter stared at Bradley with wide, terrified eyes, realizing the magnitude of the fraud he had inadvertently protected by trying to help Bradley steal my IT budget. But Martin was not finished. "It gets significantly worse, gentlemen," he continued ruthlessly. "When my client legally removed his proprietary software, Bradley panicked. Knowing the upcoming quarterly audit would expose his embezzlement, he bypassed all internal security protocols and illegally hired a mercenary black hat hacker. His goal was to brute force the encryption and steal my client's code before the auditors arrived. Instead, he triggered a defensive failsafe that completely incinerated $2 million worth of your secondary physical servers. In total, your chief financial officer has cost this company nearly $12 million in stolen funds, destroyed hardware, and halted production. The documents sitting right in front of you contain the irrefutable wire transfers, the digital footprints, and the hacker's communication logs. The evidence is absolute, undeniable, and currently ready to be handed over to federal prosecutors." Total suffocating pandemonium immediately seized the boardroom. The older board members were clutching their chests, staring at the forensic accounting documents as if they were reading their own professional obituaries. The CEO was completely paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The entire corporate empire was actively burning to the ground, and the primary arsonist was sitting right there at the table with them. Bradley remained completely catatonic, staring blankly at the polished wood, his entire life, his career, his marriage, and his freedom reduced to a stack of incriminating papers. Then the raw, ugly survival instinct kicked in. Carter, the arrogant chief operating officer who had smugly fired me just a week ago, suddenly realized that he was tightly tethered to a rapidly sinking ship. If he did not violently sever his ties to Bradley in this exact moment, he would go down as a primary co-conspirator in a massive federal fraud investigation. His career would be annihilated. Carter violently pushed his heavy leather chair back. It tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, his face flushed with panicked, self-preserving rage. "Call corporate security right now!" Carter screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at Bradley. "Lock the doors and call the police immediately. He belongs in a federal prison, and I swear to God I had absolutely nothing to do with this." Bradley leaped from his chair, his face a mask of absolute cornered fury. He pointed a trembling finger right back at Carter. "You hypocritical coward," Bradley shrieked, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "Do not act like you are an innocent victim in this. You approved the budget restructuring. You knew exactly why I needed the old man out of his department." Carter's face turned crimson, and he tried to shout over him, waving his hands frantically. "I knew nothing about your massive embezzlement, you pathological liar. I was trying to modernize the factory." Bradley let out a maniacal, spit-flecked laugh. "Modernize? You just wanted to route the new software contracts to your college fraternity brother's tech firm in exchange for a 20% kickback on the back end. You think I did not see the hidden invoices you submitted?" The boardroom instantly devolved into an absolute circus. The elite corporate litigators were shouting over each other, desperately trying to invoke attorney-client privilege and mitigate the catastrophic self-incrimination happening in real time. Two senior board members were practically screaming at the CEO, demanding immediate answers, while the CEO helplessly banged his hand against the mahogany table, trying and completely failing to regain control. Bradley and Carter were leaning over the polished wood inches apart, hurling vile accusations and exposing years of corporate corruption in a desperate, ugly display of self-preservation. It was a spectacular, pathetic implosion of the very men who had mocked my age and dismissed my value just days prior. They were tearing each other to pieces, and I had simply provided the spark. I sat in silence for a full 2 minutes, watching the pristine corporate facade completely disintegrate into a feral brawl. When I finally decided I had heard enough of their pathetic whining, I raised my right hand and brought my knuckles down hard against the solid mahogany table. The sharp, heavy rap sounded like a gunshot slicing instantly through the cacophony of shouting voices. The room froze. Carter and Bradley snapped their mouths shut, turning to look at me, their chests heaving with exertion. The board members slowly sat back in their chairs, their eyes wide and deeply unsettled by the absolute chilling calm radiating from my side of the table. I smoothed the lapels of my midnight black suit and looked directly at the trembling chief executive officer. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet but carrying enough weight to pin everyone to their seats. "Because while your supposed leadership team is busy confessing to federal felonies in front of my legal counsel, your flagship manufacturing plant is still a dead, rotting carcass, and every second you waste screaming at each other is costing your shareholders another small fortune." I did not wait for his response. I unlatched my own briefcase, bypassing the $5 million settlement check that still sat ignored on the table. I pulled out a single, sleek, black folder containing a meticulously drafted legal document prepared by Martin Thorne. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, resting my hands on top of it. "You brought a $5 million check to this meeting," I said, my gaze sweeping across the terrified faces of the board. "You thought you could simply buy your way out of the apocalypse your arrogant management created. But you fundamentally misunderstood the situation. I am not here to sell my proprietary software patent. I am not here to be paid off and sent quietly into retirement. My life's work is not for sale." I paused, letting the profound silence settle heavily over the room. The CEO swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the black folder. "Then what exactly do you want, Dexter?" the CEO asked, his voice barely above a hoarse whisper. "I want absolute control," I stated, my words striking the table like a hammer. "I am exchanging the exclusive licensing rights of my software patent for a 51% controlling interest in this specific manufacturing subsidiary. I will become the majority shareholder of the very factory I built." The board members gasped collectively, several of them physically recoiling in their expensive chairs. "That is corporate extortion." One of the senior partners sputtered, his face red with indignation. "It is corporate salvation," I corrected him sharply. "Without my encryption key, your robotic assembly lines will never move again. You cannot replace my code, you cannot reverse engineer it, and you certainly cannot afford the decade of litigation required to fight me in federal court. Your entire infrastructure is currently being held hostage by your own incompetence." I turned my gaze slowly toward Carter, who was sweating profusely, his hands trembling on the table. "My second condition is non-negotiable," I continued. "Carter is to be terminated immediately, for cause. He will be stripped of all stock options, his severance package is fully revoked, and he will be escorted out of this building by security before this meeting concludes." Carter let out a choked gasp, shaking his head in frantic denial, but no one on the board moved to defend him. They were already calculating the math, and Carter was nothing more than an acceptable casualty. Finally, I looked directly at the chief executive officer, the man who had allowed this culture of arrogant disrespect to fester under his watch. And my final condition, I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, unforgiving dominance. I will be appointed as the new chairman of the board for this manufacturing division. You thought I was an outdated dinosaur, an old black man who had overstayed his welcome in your pristine corporate tower. You thought you could simply throw me away. Now you are going to answer directly to me. The sheer audacity of my demands hung in the suffocating air, an uncompromising ultimatum that left zero room for negotiation. A female board member sitting near the window suddenly gasped, staring down at her glowing tablet. The quarterly earnings report just leaked, she whispered, her voice laced with absolute dread. The financial sector has caught wind of the factory shutdown. Our stock price is in a free fall. We have lost 12% of our market capitalization in the last 20 minutes alone. Panic swept through the room like a physical shockwave. They were bleeding out, and I was the only man holding the tourniquet. The board of directors exchanged desperate, defeated glances. There was no debate. There were no counteroffers. They had absolutely no choice left. Slowly, with a trembling hand, the chief executive officer reached across the polished mahogany table and picked up his expensive fountain pen. He pulled the sleek black folder toward him, opening the contract that would officially sign over his empire. The scratch of the expensive fountain pen against the heavy parchment paper was the only sound in the massive, suffocating room. The chief executive officer signed his name on the bottom line, his hand shaking so violently that the signature barely resembled his own. He closed the sleek black folder and pushed it slowly across the polished mahogany table back toward Martin Thorne. Martin opened it, inspected the fresh ink with a sharp clinical eye, and gave me a single definitive nod. The transaction was officially complete. I was no longer a discarded, retired engineer. I was the absolute majority shareholder and the reigning chairman of the board for their most lucrative manufacturing division. The empire had officially changed hands. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I set it squarely on the table and opened the screen. Every executive in the room held their breath, their eyes glued to my hands. I inserted the encrypted physical drive into the primary access port. A command prompt flashed across the dark screen demanding the master override sequence. I typed a single complex string of characters with steady, practiced precision and hit the enter key. For 5 agonizing seconds, the room remained dead silent. Then a deep, resonant vibration shook the floorboards beneath our feet. The dim emergency backup lighting flickered and seamlessly transitioned into the bright, piercing white glow of full operational power. Through the thick glass walls, the digital productivity monitors lining the hallways instantly switched from a catastrophic flashing red to a steady, stabilizing green. Deep within the bowels of the facility, the massive robotic assembly arms roared back to life, their hydraulic joints hissing as they resumed the aborted production line. The thermal regulators engaged, immediately flooding the vital server rooms with necessary coolant. The catastrophic financial hemorrhage had stopped. The factory was alive again. The board members let out a collective heavy sigh of relief, slumping back into their luxurious chairs. They had successfully stopped the bleeding, but they suddenly realized they had just surrendered their entire kingdom to the very man they had tried to throw out into the street. Before anyone could speak, a new, entirely different sound pierced the heavy atmosphere of the boardroom. The sharp, unmistakable wail of police sirens echoed from the city streets far below, growing rapidly louder as multiple vehicles converged directly on the corporate headquarters. The board members exchanged confused, terrified glances. The wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by the chaotic screech of tires on the pavement outside the main lobby. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy double doors of the boardroom were thrown open with absolute, uncompromising force. 4 federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers and stern, unforgiving expressions strode into the room, followed closely by 2 uniformed city police officers. The lead agent bypassed the terrified chief executive officer entirely. He walked straight down the length of the mahogany table, his eyes locked onto one specific target. Bradley scrambled backward, his expensive leather chair tipping over and crashing onto the floor as he desperately tried to put distance between himself and the federal authorities. Bradley, the lead agent, announced, his voice booming with legal authority. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and corporate espionage." The color completely vanished from Bradley's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a trapdoor with a noose around his neck. He frantically looked around the room, his wide, panicked eyes pleading for salvation. He looked at Carter, who immediately averted his gaze. He looked at the board members, who sat frozen in self-preserving silence. Finally, he looked at me. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table, offering him absolutely nothing but a cold, hard stare. The uniform officers grabbed Bradley by the arms, forcefully spinning him around and slamming him against the glass wall. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the most beautiful sound I had heard all week. "You cannot do this!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with sheer pathetic terror as they dragged him away from the wall. "I am a corporate officer. I demand my lawyer." The agents ignored his frantic protests entirely. They marched him out of the boardroom in front of his elite peers, stripping away his false pedigree, his unearned status, and his stolen dignity in one swift, brutal stroke. The man who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward was now being hauled off to a federal holding cell, crying like a cornered coward. The chaotic commotion of Bradley's arrest left the remaining executives in a state of absolute shock. The room was deathly quiet once again. But my house cleaning was not yet finished. I turned my attention to Carter. The young, arrogant chief operating officer who had initiated this entire catastrophe was standing near the window, sweating through his tailored designer suit. He realized that his protection was gone. His ally was in handcuffs, and his newly appointed chairman of the board was sitting directly across from him. Carter swallowed hard, his survival instinct overriding his shattered pride. He took a hesitant step toward my end of the table, plastering a weak, sickeningly desperate smile across his face. Dexter Carter stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Sir, please listen to me. I was completely manipulated by Bradley. He fed me falsified financial reports to force your termination. I had no idea he was a criminal. I am a dedicated executive. I know the operational framework of this company better than anyone. We can work together. I can be an incredibly valuable asset to your new administration. Please do not throw my career away over a misunderstanding." I looked at the man who had smugly told me I was a relic just a few days ago. The man who had ordered me to pack my things and leave because I was too old to be useful. I stood up slowly from my chair, buttoning my midnight black suit jacket, and walked around the table until I was standing inches away from him. Carter flinched, shrinking back under my towering presence. "I do not negotiate with obsolete liabilities," I said, my voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. The corporate security guards who had escorted the federal agents upstairs were still standing near the open doorway. I gestured toward them without breaking eye contact with Carter. "Strip him of his access badge," I commanded loudly. "Escort him down to his office, give him exactly one cardboard box for his personal items, and then throw him out onto the front sidewalk. If he ever steps foot on this property again, have him arrested for criminal trespassing." Carter gasped, his face twisting in complete humiliation. "You cannot just throw me out like trash," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I am the chief operating officer. You are a terminated contractor," I replied, feeding his exact words back to him with lethal precision. "We are modernizing our workforce, Carter, and we no longer require your services." Security grabbed him by the arms. He thrashed and begged as they physically dragged him out of the room, his pathetic cries fading down the hallway until the heavy doors finally swung shut. The infection had been surgically removed. The boardroom was finally purged of the parasites who had tried to steal my life's work. I turned my back to the terrified board of directors walking past the empty seats of the men I had just destroyed. I approached the head of the table. The chief executive officer quickly scrambled out of the massive high-backed leather chairman's chair, retreating to the sidelines like a defeated soldier yielding to a conquering king. I turned around and sat down in the heavy leather seat. The material creaked under my weight, conforming perfectly to my posture. I swiveled the chair slightly to face the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the bustling city streets far below. From my high vantage point, I possessed a perfect, unobstructed view of the main entrance. I watched intently as the heavy glass doors of the lobby opened. Down on the concrete pavement, corporate security shoved Carter onto the sidewalk, tossing his pathetic cardboard box right onto the ground beside him. Just a few yards away, the federal agents forcefully shoved a handcuffed, weeping Bradley into the back seat of a heavily armored police cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights reflected sharply against the towering glass facade of the building I now officially controlled. The corporate war was absolutely over, and I had emerged as the undisputed victor. The boardroom was mine. The factory was mine. The justice I demanded was fully served. But as I watched the police cruiser pull away from the curb and merge into the dense city traffic, a heavy, unavoidable realization settled over my mind. I had completely annihilated the enemies who attacked my professional life, but the most painful confrontation was still waiting for me.
Bradley was going to a federal prison, which meant his entire fraudulent world was collapsing, and my daughter, the woman who had foolishly chosen him over her own father, was about to face the devastating reality of her absolute ruin. Tasha sat in the sterile, windowless visitation room of the federal detention center. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a relentless, annoying hum, casting a sickly pallor over the concrete block walls. The air smelled strongly of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and deeply ingrained despair. Her entire world had completely evaporated in the span of 72 hours. Her premium bank accounts were entirely frozen by federal investigators tracing Bradley's massive embezzlement. The locks on her sprawling suburban estate had been legally changed by her father's aggressive legal team. She had slept on a cheap, lumpy motel bed the previous night, her mind spinning endlessly with the horrifying revelations of her husband's true monstrous nature. She had lost her status, her wealth, and her dignity. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the stark room groaned open, snapping her out of her hollow, traumatized daze. A stern corrections officer escorted Bradley into the room. He was wearing an ill-fitting standard-issue orange jumpsuit that completely stripped him of his executive armor. Without his tailored designer suits, his expensive luxury watch, and the affluent backdrop of their corporate lifestyle, he looked incredibly small, pathetic, and shockingly ordinary. His hair was greasy and unkempt, the dark circles under his eyes revealing a total lack of sleep and the crushing anxiety of facing decades in prison. Yet as he sat down in the cold metal chair across the table from her, he did not look like a man consumed by remorse or guilt. His posture stiffened defensively, and that familiar, sickeningly arrogant smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Despite being locked in a federal cage, he still believed he was the smartest person in the room. He still believed he was entirely untouchable. Bradley leaned forward, his forearms resting heavily on the cold steel table separating them. He did not ask how she was holding up. He did not apologize for lying to her for months, for embezzling millions of dollars from his employer, or for attempting to illegally steal her childhood home to fund his escape. He did not express a single ounce of regret for the vile, racist hatred he had spewed about her father in that real estate office. Instead, he glared at her with intense, irritated impatience. "What took you so long?" Bradley snapped, his tone laced with raw, unapologetic entitlement. "I have been rotting in this concrete cell for 3 agonizing days. You should have been standing right here the absolute second they processed my booking." Tasha stared at him, her voice barely a hollow whisper. "My accounts are totally frozen, Bradley. The federal agents locked down everything connected to your name and the company. I have absolutely nothing left." Bradley rolled his eyes, letting out a sharp, exasperated sigh as if she were a remarkably slow child failing to grasp a basic concept. "Then you need to figure it out, Tasha," he demanded, slamming his open palm lightly against the table to emphasize his absolute authority. "I cannot stay in this disgusting place. I am a top-tier corporate executive, not a common street thug. You have your 5-carat diamond engagement ring. You have the gold Cartier watch I bought you for our anniversary. Go down to the Diamond District and liquidate them immediately for cash. And if that is not enough to cover my exorbitant bail, you go find a private lender. I do not care if you have to go to the underground loan sharks in the city and mortgage your own future. You take out whatever high-interest loans you have to, and you get me out of here by tonight. Do you understand me?" He was barking orders at her, treating her not as a wife in distress, but as a completely expendable tool meant to serve his survival. "You are absolutely useless when things get difficult," he muttered, shaking his head in profound, toxic disgust. "I provided you with a life of total luxury, and the one time I actually need you to pull your weight, you sit there crying like a victim. Stop being a pathetic liability and go get my money." The sheer, unabashed cruelty of his words hung heavy in the sterile air. He had completely stripped away the final layer of his polished, loving facade. He did not love her. He had never loved her. He only valued her utility. Tasha remained perfectly silent, absorbing the full, devastating weight of his absolute narcissism. In that cold, unforgiving room, the lingering, desperate illusions she held about her marriage violently shattered into a million pieces. The chilling warning her father had delivered in his hotel suite echoed with crystal clarity in her mind. "He loves the financial shield that I provided. He does not love you. He loves the ATM that carries my name. And the second he realizes that the ATM is permanently closed, he will discard you without a second thought." Her father had been entirely painfully right.
Bradley was nothing more than a parasitic, manipulative coward who fed relentlessly on the strength and wealth of others. The profound, hollow sorrow in her chest instantly hardened into a fierce, righteous, and burning anger. The tears dried in her eyes, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. Tasha slowly stood up from the metal chair, her posture straightening as a new, undeniable strength surged through her veins. Bradley looked up, visibly annoyed by her sudden movement, fully expecting her to scramble out the door to blindly obey his commands and secure his release. Instead, Tasha reached back and swung her arm with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp cracking sound of her palm colliding with his cheek echoed like a gunshot in the small concrete visitation room. The sheer force of the physical blow whipped Bradley's head violently to the side, leaving a bright, burning red handprint plastered across his pale, shocked skin. He gasped in profound disbelief, clutching his stinging face as he looked back at her in pure, unadulterated terror. "Do not ever speak to me again," Tasha said, her voice vibrating with a cold, absolute authority she had inherited directly from her father. "I am not your shield, I am not your pawn, and I am certainly not your personal ATM." She unclasped her designer purse, reached inside, and pulled out a thick, legally binding document she had aggressively obtained from a high-powered family lawyer that very morning. She slammed the paperwork down onto the steel table right in front of him. They were expedited divorce papers citing irrefutable fraud, emotional abuse, and criminal felony charges. "You are going to rot in a federal prison, Bradley," she stated, looking down at the pathetic man cowering in his orange jumpsuit. "And you are going to do it completely alone. Sign the papers or my father's elite legal team will make sure you never see the light of day again." She did not wait for his response. She turned on her heel and walked directly toward the heavy steel door. Tasha pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Federal Detention Center and stepped out into the bleak gray afternoon. A cold, relentless rain was pouring down from the dark sky, instantly soaking through her thin designer coat. She stood on the concrete steps, shivering as the freezing water washed over her face, mingling with the very last tears she would ever shed for Bradley. The terrifying reality of her situation was absolute. She had no money, her credit cards were completely useless, and she had no house to return to. She was utterly destitute, completely stripped of the luxurious, insulated life she had falsely believed she earned. But as the cold rain soaked her clothes, she also felt an undeniable, profound sense of liberation. The toxic, parasitic weight of her husband was finally gone. She reached into her damp pocket and pulled out her cell phone. Her hands trembled violently from the freezing cold and the sheer magnitude of what she was about to do. She scrolled through her contacts, stopped on a single familiar name, and pressed the call button. She held the phone to her ear, listening to the dialing tone, desperately hoping the man she had so foolishly betrayed would still answer. The cab ride to my downtown luxury condominium was the longest journey Tasha had ever experienced. She paid the driver with the last damp $20 bill she had in her pocket. The freezing rain continued to pour relentlessly as she approached the heavy glass doors of my building, her expensive clothes clinging desperately to her shivering frame. When my private doorbell rang, I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows, nursing a glass of bourbon and watching the storm batter the sprawling city skyline. I set the crystal glass down, walked across the pristine hardwood floor, and pulled the heavy oak door open. Tasha stood in the brightly lit hallway, completely drenched from head to toe. Her designer coat was soaked entirely through her hair, was plastered against her pale face, and her dark mascara ran down her cheeks in messy, pathetic streaks. She looked up at me, her eyes overflowing with fresh, agonizing tears. In that brief moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to run to me whenever she scraped her knee or woke up terrified from a bad nightmare. She took a hesitant step forward, raising her trembling arms, fully expecting me to pull her into a warm, unconditionally forgiving embrace. She desperately expected me to wrap my strong arms around her, tell her that everything was going to be all right, and immediately restore her to a life of effortless luxury and absolute comfort. She wanted her daddy to make the bad things magically disappear and shield her from the brutal consequences of her own terrible decisions. I stepped aside, leaving my arms firmly resting by my sides, and simply gestured for her to enter. I did not offer her a comforting hug. I did not offer her a warm towel or a cup of hot tea. I closed the door behind her and walked back into the center of the expansive living room, creating a deliberate physical distance between us. Tasha stood dripping on the polished floor, wrapping her arms around her own shivering torso, deeply confused and wounded by my icy reception. "Dad," she sobbed. her voice echoing pitifully in the quiet, cavernous room. "I am so sorry. You were right about absolutely everything. Bradley is a complete monster. I left him at the detention center. I gave him the divorce papers and I walked away forever. I have absolutely nothing left. My bank accounts are frozen solid and I have nowhere else to go. Please, I just need to come back home." I looked at my daughter, feeling a profound, heavy ache in my chest, but I utterly refused to let it show on my face. "You are standing in my home, Tasha," I said, my voice echoing with a heavy, uncompromising authority. "I will not let you freeze out on the city streets, but you need to understand something right now, and you need to understand it with absolute, terrifying clarity. Your willful ignorance and your blinding greed almost destroyed my entire life's work. You chose the comfort of a manipulative parasite over the father, who provided you with every single advantage you have ever had. You stood right there in my living room and watched that man threaten to lock me inside a psychiatric ward, and you did not say a single word to defend me. You chose your luxury over my freedom." Tasha hung her head, the tears falling freely onto the floor as the crushing weight of her massive failures finally settled onto her shoulders. "I know," she whispered, her voice breaking with genuine remorse. "I was so incredibly stupid. I was blind to who he really was. I want to make it right, Dad. I want to start over. If you truly want to start over," I continued, my tone slicing through her apologies like a surgical blade, "then the fairy tale is officially over. There is no more free ride. There is no more living like corporate royalty on my dime. You do not get to walk back into this family and simply resume your position as a pampered lady of the house. That version of your life ended the exact second you walked out my door and chose Bradley over me." I walked over to the leather armchair where I had placed a folded stack of fabric earlier that evening. I picked it up, walked back to Tasha, and dropped the heavy bundle directly into her trembling hands. She looked down at the rough industrial material. It was a standard issue dark blue worker uniform for the manufacturing floor of my semiconductor plant. A pair of heavy scuffed steel-toed boots sat on the floor right beside the chair. "What is this?" Tasha asked, her voice filled with raw confusion as she ran her manicured fingers over the coarse, unforgiving fabric. "That is your new reality," I stated firmly, my eyes locking onto hers. "As the new chairman of the board, I have authorized the Human Resources Department to hire you as a junior floor technician on the first shift assembly line. You will earn the standard minimum wage. You will clock in exactly at 6 in the morning, and you will clock out at 6 in the evening. You will sweep the concrete floors, you will scrub the heavy machine housings, and you will learn exactly how much brutal physical labor is required to generate a single dollar of the wealth you so carelessly took for granted." Tasha stared at the uniform, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the massive fall she was taking. "But Dad, I do not know anything about factory work," she protested weakly, her voice trembling. "I have a master's degree in business administration. I cannot do manual labor down in the dirt. I do not care about your business degree." I snapped, my voice hardening into impenetrable steel. "Your fancy degree did not stop you from marrying a federal criminal, and it did not stop you from turning your back on your own flesh and blood. You want my forgiveness, and you want a permanent place in my life. Then you are going to earn it with sweat, blistered hands, and utter humility. You are going to start from the absolute bottom of the factory floor, just like I did 40 years ago when I built this life for us. You will pay me a portion of your weekly wages for room and board. You will learn the true value of hard work and respect, or you will pack your bags and figure out how to survive on the streets completely alone." I turned my back to her and walked toward my private study, leaving her standing there with the heavy uniform in her hands. "The guest room is down the hall," I said over my shoulder. "Your shift starts in exactly 8 hours. Do not be late." The next morning, the sky was still pitch black when the shrill alarm blared in Tasha's sparse guest room. Her body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion from the emotional trauma of the previous days, but she dragged herself out of bed. She stripped off her ruined designer clothes and pulled on the coarse dark blue factory uniform. It felt incredibly heavy, a physical manifestation of the harsh penance she was now forced to endure. She laced up the heavy steel-toed boots, tied her hair back into a tight, no-nonsense ponytail, and caught a city bus to the sprawling industrial complex. As she walked through the heavy metal employee doors and stepped onto the massive, roaring factory floor, the sheer intimidating scale of the environment hit her like a physical blow. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and industrial machine oil. She gripped her yellow time card tightly, walking slowly toward the primary assembly line. But as she approached her assigned sector, the blood completely drained from her face. Standing around the heavy machinery were the seasoned veteran floor workers. These were the exact same hard-working men and women her ex-husband Bradley had mercilessly exploited, the people whose wages he had casually threatened to cut and whose entire livelihoods he had recklessly gambled away. They stopped working and turned their heads, their cold, hard eyes locking onto the former corporate princess who was now wearing their uniform, and they did not look the least bit forgiving. Exactly 1 month had passed since I completely purged the corporate boardroom and claimed my rightful seat as chairman. Down on the factory floor, Tasha was surviving the brutal reality of her new life, sweeping concrete and facing the cold, unforgiving stares of the seasoned workers she had once deemed beneath her. She did not quit. She took the hostility, kept her head down, and scrubbed the machine housings until her hands blistered. I monitored her progress through the daily supervisor reports, but I did not intervene. She was learning the heavy price of her arrogance. While my daughter was slowly rebuilding her character from the ground up, the men who had orchestrated my attempted destruction were discovering that gravity is a remarkably cruel force when you are falling from the very top of the corporate ladder. I was sitting behind my massive mahogany desk reviewing the quarterly production metrics when my private secure line began to ring. I did not recognize the incoming number, but I answered it with my usual calm authority. A heavy, nervous silence greeted me on the other end, followed by a shaky, completely defeated breath. "Dexter," a voice rasped, entirely stripped of its former volume and confidence. "It is Carter." I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair, interlacing my fingers. The former chief operating officer had been completely radioactive since the day I had security throw him out onto the pavement. The financial sector is a very small, highly communicative world. The news of how he had blindly fired the sole proprietor of a vital software patent, nearly melted down a flagship semiconductor plant, and inadvertently harbored a federal embezzler had spread like wildfire. No reputable technology firm would even look at his resume. He was a professional pariah, bleeding through his savings and facing total financial ruin. I am calling because I am completely out of options. Carter continued, his voice trembling with the raw, humiliating desperation of a man who had lost absolutely everything. Nobody will hire me. The recruitment agencies will not even return my emails. I know we had our differences, and I know I handled your transition poorly, but I have a family. I have a mortgage I can no longer afford. I am begging you, Dexter. You are the chairman now. You have absolute hiring authority. I will take anything. A mid-level consultant role, a shift manager position, anything you can offer. I will work for a fraction of my old salary. Please, I just need a single chance to prove my worth again. I let his pathetic, groveling pleas hang in the air for a long moment. He had not apologized for disrespecting my 4 decades of service. He had only apologized because he was suffering the severe consequences of his own ego. Come to the corporate headquarters tomorrow at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I said smoothly. We will see if you are a fit for our new direction. I disconnected the call before he could utter another word of thanks. The following afternoon, Carter arrived at the main lobby of the corporate tower. I watched him on the high-definition security feeds transmitted directly to the monitors in my private office. He was no longer wearing his custom-tailored Italian suits. He wore a cheap, poorly fitted gray jacket that hung loosely on his shoulders, a stark physical representation of his massive fall from grace. He approached the front reception desk, gave his name, and waited for the receptionist to print his visitor badge. She did not give him a badge. Following my strict, explicit instructions, she simply pointed to a row of hard plastic chairs positioned right in the center of the bustling, highly visible main lobby. "Mr. Rollins is currently occupied," the receptionist told him coldly. "Please take a seat. He will call for you when he is ready." Carter sat down in the uncomfortable plastic chair. He did not wait for 15 minutes. He did not wait for an hour. I made him sit right there in the middle of the lobby for 3 agonizing, deeply humiliating hours. I sat in my climate-controlled office sipping premium dark coffee, watching him endure a masterclass in psychological torture. Between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, the lobby was a constant hub of high-volume traffic. Shift changes occurred. Corporate executives walked through the revolving doors to grab late lunches. Maintenance staff passed by with heavy equipment carts. Every single employee who walked through that massive glass atrium recognized him. They saw the former arrogant chief operating officer, who used to scream at them for minor infractions, now sitting in a cheap suit, sweating profusely, staring down at his scuffed shoes in total inescapable shame. He shifted uncomfortably, constantly checking his watch, but he did not leave. He was too financially desperate to walk away. He swallowed every ounce of his remaining pride and simply took the public degradation. At exactly 4 o'clock, I pressed the intercom button on my desk and instructed my assistant to send the applicant upstairs. 10 minutes later, my heavy oak office doors slowly opened. Carter stepped into the expansive chairman's suite. He looked completely exhausted, emotionally drained, and physically diminished. He practically shrank under the sheer scale of the room he had once tried to dominate. He took a hesitant step toward my mahogany desk, forcing a weak, incredibly pathetic smile. "Dexter," he started, his voice cracking nervously as he instinctively reached out to offer a handshake. "Thank you so much for agreeing to see me. I have spent the last 3 hours thinking about how I can bring massive value back to this company. I have drawn up a few operational proposals that I think you will find highly effective." I did not stand up. I did not offer him a chair. I did not extend my hand to accept his greeting. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on the pristine surface of my desk, and I stared directly into his eyes. I did not speak. I let absolute suffocating silence fill the massive room. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. The silence became incredibly heavy, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. Carter's weak smile violently faltered. His outstretched hand slowly dropped back to his side. The desperate hope in his eyes rapidly morphed into a sudden, terrifying realization. He suddenly understood that I had never intended to hire him. I had made him sit in the public lobby for 3 hours solely to break his spirit and ensure that every employee in the building witnessed his absolute ruin. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. "We are restructuring the company, Carter," I stated, my voice echoing with cold, unforgiving, metallic precision. "We are modernizing our workforce, and we no longer require the services of an outdated, incompetent executive." The color completely drained from his face. His mouth dropped open as he recognized the exact verbatim sentences he had smugly delivered to me over the phone on the day he fired me. I reached over and pressed the security button on my console. "Pack up your remaining dignity and have security escort you off my premises," I commanded. The heavy oak doors swung open immediately. 2 large, muscular security guards stepped into the office, the exact same guards he used to command with an iron fist. They grabbed Carter by his trembling arms. He did not fight back. He did not scream. The sheer, brutal poetry of his execution completely broke his mind. He hung his head in total defeat and allowed himself to be dragged out of my office, a permanent ghost of the corporate world. I leaned back in my leather chair, feeling a deep, resonating satisfaction settle into my bones. The arrogant executive who had tried to erase my legacy had just been completely erased from existence. I turned my attention away from the closed oak doors and looked over at the massive flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my office. It was tuned to a premier national financial news network running on silent, with the closed captioning scrolling rapidly across the bottom of the screen. The breaking news banner suddenly flashed a bright, urgent crimson red. A photograph of Bradley, looking haggard, unshaven, and completely ruined in his orange federal jumpsuit, appeared on the screen. The news anchor was reporting live from the federal courthouse downtown. Because all of Bradley's assets and offshore accounts had been completely frozen by the federal authorities, he had been entirely unable to hire elite defense attorneys. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender against a ruthless team of federal prosecutors armed with the mountain of forensic evidence Martin Thorne had handed them. The headline text delivered the final crushing blow. Former Chief Financial Officer Bradley sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for grand wire fraud and corporate espionage without the possibility of early parole. The heavy steel doors of justice had officially slammed shut on his life. I took a slow sip of my dark coffee. My enemies were buried, but the quiet peace of my new empire was about to be challenged by a lingering shadow from the old board of directors. The transition of absolute power is rarely without friction. While I had successfully excised the primary tumors from the corporate body, a lingering infection remained deeply embedded within the old guard. A faction of legacy shareholders and veteran board members deeply resented my sudden ascension. They were men born into generational wealth who despised taking orders from a former contractor, especially a 69-year-old black man they had routinely dismissed as mere maintenance staff. This faction was spearheaded by Richard Kensington, a pompous old money executive who believed corporate dominance was his absolute birthright. Kensington could not stomach the reality that an engineer had outmaneuvered the entire executive suite. For weeks, he had been quietly gathering the remaining disgruntled board members, pooling their minority voting shares to build a silent coalition. They convened late on a Thursday evening in the dimly lit, oak-paneled private room of an exclusive downtown cigar lounge. The air was thick with imported smoke and misplaced confidence. Kensington and his three co-conspirators were actively drafting a formal motion for a vote of no confidence. Their strategy was to blindside me at the upcoming quarterly review, utilizing a procedural loophole to temporarily strip my executive authority and force a hostile buyout of my shares. They genuinely believed I was just a lucky technician who had stumbled into the boardroom. They assumed I possessed no understanding of high-level financial warfare and that I would crumble the second they applied institutional pressure. They were raising glasses of expensive Scotch toasting to my imminent downfall, completely unaware that I was already 10 steps ahead of their pathetic little coup. What Kensington and his archaic country club coalition failed to understand was that I treated corporate finance exactly like a complex circuitry grid. When you want to neutralize a malfunctioning component, you do not attack its thickest armor. You simply locate its power source and completely sever the connection. While they were busy whispering in smoke-filled rooms, I was sitting in Martin Thorne's secure legal office mapping out their entire financial lifeblood. During the forensic audit of Bradley's massive embezzlement, Martin's elite team of accountants had uncovered a series of highly leveraged, extremely toxic financial positions held by Kensington and his faction. These men liked to project an image of untouchable wealth, but the reality was far more precarious. They were deeply entangled in a network of shadow lending firms and failing commercial real estate portfolios. They had leveraged their own personal estates to cover massive losses in the commercial sector. I did not use a single dime of company money to execute my countermeasure. I utilized the vast, untouchable liquid assets sitting perfectly idle inside my private blind trust. Moving with absolute predatory silence, I directed Martin to systematically purchase the exact holding companies and private equity firms that owned the toxic debt of Kensington's faction. It was a masterclass in aggressive, invisible financial acquisition. Over the course of 5 days, I bought their mortgages. I bought their margin loans. I essentially became their primary undisputed creditor without their knowledge. They were plotting to steal my manufacturing empire while I was actively purchasing the very ground they walked on. Martin sat across from me in his office, sliding the final, fully executed acquisition contracts across his polished desk. "We have them, Dexter," Martin said, a lethal smile spreading across his sharp features. "You legally own every single promissory note attached to Richard Kensington and his 3 silent partners. If they miss a single payment, or if the primary creditor decides to instantly call in the margin loans due to market volatility, they will face total catastrophic bankruptcy within 48 hours. I picked up the heavy stack of contracts, feeling the absolute undeniable weight of total leverage in my hands. "They want to initiate a hostile takeover," I stated, sliding the documents into my leather briefcase. "Let us go show them what a real hostile takeover looks like." The heavy oak doors of the exclusive cigar lounge swung open, shattering the quiet, self-congratulatory atmosphere of the private back room. Kensington and his 3 accomplices froze, their glasses of scotch hovering halfway to their lips. I walked into the room with Martin Thorne right beside me. The thick cloud of cigar smoke did not slow my deliberate, measured strides. I bypassed the empty leather chairs and walked directly to the center of their antique wooden table. Kensington slammed his crystal glass down his face, instantly flushing with a mixture of shock and profound indignation. "What the hell is the meaning of this?" Kensington demanded, his voice rising in an aggressive, entitled bark. "This is a highly restricted private club. You cannot just barge in here. Security will throw you out into the street." I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, emotional outburst. I simply unlatched my briefcase and dropped the heavy stack of acquisition contracts directly onto the table right next to his expensive scotch. "Security works for the men who own the building," Richard Befrisch replied, my voice slicing through the hazy air with icy precision. "And as of this morning, my private equity firm officially owns the commercial mortgage on this very establishment. I suggest you sit down and close your mouth before I have you permanently banned from your own sanctuary." Kensington stared at me, his bluster violently faltering as the sheer gravity of my words registered. He slowly sank back into his leather chair, casting a terrified glance at the thick legal folders. Martin stepped forward, tapping his finger sharply against the top document. "You gentlemen plan to initiate a vote of no confidence against my client next week," Martin announced, exposing their secret coup with ruthless clarity. "You intended to weaponize your minority shares to force him out. The fatal flaw in your strategy is that you leveraged your personal estates to fund your failing commercial ventures. My client just purchased the primary shadow lending firm that holds your toxic debt. He owns your margin loans." I leaned over the table, staring directly into Kensington's wide, panicked eyes. "If you utter a single word against me in the boardroom, I will instantly call in every single margin loan you possess," I stated softly. "I will foreclose on your estates, liquidate your personal assets, and leave you entirely bankrupt before the market closes on Monday. You thought you were hunting a vulnerable old man. You walked blindly into an execution. I am not here to negotiate your surrender. I am here to dictate the terms of your permanent exile." Martin pulled 4 separate resignation letters and stock transfer agreements from his portfolio, sliding one to each man. "You will sign your immediate resignations from the board of directors I commanded, and you will sell your remaining minority shares back to the corporate treasury for pennies on the dollar. You are officially erased from this company." The 4 legacy executives stared at the documents, completely paralyzed by the sudden, brutal annihilation of their corporate power. There was no room for debate. There was no legal maneuver they could utilize to escape the massive financial snare I had closed around their necks. One by one, their hands shaking with a potent mixture of raw fury and inescapable defeat, they picked up their pens and signed their corporate lives away. Kensington was the last to sign, his face pale and completely broken. I gathered the signed documents, secured them in my briefcase, and turned my back on the ruined men. Martin and I walked out of the smoke-filled room and stepped back into the cool, crisp night air of the city streets. The final remnants of the old guard had been completely eradicated. I had systematically removed every single enemy, every parasite, and every arrogant executive who had threatened my legacy. The boardroom was entirely purged. I held absolute uncontested power over the manufacturing empire I had built. With my corporate throne permanently secured, my unyielding focus finally shifted away from the glass towers and back down to the roaring factory floor. It was time to secure the future of my bloodline. 6 months had evaporated since the day I stripped my daughter of her unearned luxury and cast her down into the harsh, unforgiving reality of the manufacturing floor. The transformation was not immediate, but it was absolute. It was currently 3 a.m, the dead center of the grueling night shift. Down in the sprawling, cavernous belly of the semiconductor plant, the deafening roar of industrial machinery drowned out all other sound. The air was thick with the sharp metallic tang of ozone-heated copper and heavy machine oil. Tasha was stationed at Sector 7, one of the most physically demanding zones on the primary assembly line. She wore the standard-issue dark blue uniform, but it no longer looked like a costume. It was deeply stained with grease, sweat, and the unavoidable grime of intense manual labor. Her hands, once perfectly manicured and adorned with expensive jewelry, were now rough, calloused, and wrapped in heavy utility gloves. She wiped a thick streak of dark oil from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a dirty smudge across her brow. She was bone-tired. I could see the profound physical exhaustion weighing down her shoulders, but her posture remained incredibly rigid and unbroken. For 6 entire months, she had not complained a single time. She never asked for a break. She never requested a transfer to an easier department. She never once marched up to my executive suite to beg for her old life back. She simply put her head down and worked with a silent, ferocious intensity. The seasoned floor workers, who had initially treated her with absolute disdain, had slowly begun to accept her presence. They watched her take the hardest jobs, scrub the heaviest machine housings, and bleed right alongside them. She was no longer the pampered, arrogant corporate wife of the man who had tried to destroy their livelihoods. She was just another worker grinding through the midnight shift, earning every single dollar she took home. She was finally paying the heavy toll of her past mistakes with her own sweat. The steady, rhythmic hum of the factory floor was suddenly and violently interrupted. A harsh, grinding mechanical screech echoed from the center of the primary assembly line. The massive conveyor belt carrying highly sensitive microprocessors violently shuddered and ground to a complete catastrophic halt. Instantly, the overhead lighting in Sector 7 shifted from a steady white to a frantic flashing yellow and then to a blaring, urgent red. The automated robotic sorting arms froze mid-motion, locking up the entire production queue. The sudden silence from the halted machinery was instantly filled by the blaring wail of local proximity alarms. Workers scrambled backward, shouting confused technical updates over the noise. The night shift foreman, a grizzled 30-year veteran of the factory named Davis, sprinted down the metal walkway toward the jammed sector. He pushed his way through the crowd of panicked technicians and immediately accessed the primary diagnostic terminal bolted to the safety railing. His fingers hammered across the keyboard, his eyes scanning the cascading lines of error codes flooding the screen. It was a catastrophic subsystem desynchronization. The localized cache had completely corrupted, throwing the automated safety protocols into a hard lockdown. Davis tried to trigger the standard manual override, but the system flatly rejected his credentials. The error was buried deep within the proprietary logic gates of the machine's base code. Davis cursed loudly, wiping sweat from his face. The bottleneck was already backing up the secondary lines. Within 10 minutes, the entire night shift production quota would be completely ruined, costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. There was only one person who intimately understood the complex proprietary architecture of that specific subsystem, the man who had written the code. Davis reached for his heavy-duty radio clipped to his belt. He looked terrified. He knew calling the chairman of the board at 3 a.m. to fix a localized floor error was a massive breach of protocol, but the alternative was letting the entire production line burn down on his watch. He pressed the transmission button, fully preparing to wake me up and beg for an emergency remote override. Before Davis could speak a single word into his radio, a gloved hand shot out and forcefully pushed the device down. Davis spun around, his eyes wide with anger and surprise. Tasha stood right next to him. Her face was smudged with dark grease, her uniform soaked with sweat, but her eyes burned with an intense, absolute clarity. "Do not call him, Tasha," commanded her voice, cutting through the noise of the blaring alarms with striking authority. "Step aside and let me look at the terminal." Davis stared at her in sheer disbelief. He knew she was my daughter, but to him she was just a junior floor sweeper with zero operational clearance. "We do not have time for this," Davis shouted over the sirens. "This is a core logic failure. The entire belt is locked out. Only the chairman knows how to bypass this specific cache corruption. Step away from the terminal." Tasha did not move. She planted her steel-toed boots firmly on the metal grating and pushed past him, placing her hands directly on the diagnostic keyboard. "I know this architecture," Tasha stated firmly. "I can fix it." She stared at the cascading lines of red error codes. For a brief, fleeting moment, the noise of the factory completely faded away. Her mind instantly flashed back 25 years. She was not thinking about her expensive business degree or her former life of luxury. She remembered sitting on a wooden stool in our old home garage, watching me solder circuit boards and write basic logic gates on an outdated monitor. I had spent countless hours teaching her the fundamental language of machines, showing her how to bypass corrupted memory caches and manually force hardware resets. She had buried those memories under decades of corporate entitlement, but the knowledge was still there, hardwired into her brain. Tasha took a deep breath, her fingers flying across the industrial keyboard with sudden, aggressive precision. She bypassed the standard graphical interface and opened the raw command prompt. She rapidly typed a highly complex string of secondary override commands, isolating the corrupted cache and forcing the robotic servos to accept a manual reboot sequence. Davis watched in absolute stunned silence as she effortlessly navigated the proprietary code. She finished the command string, held her breath for a fraction of a second, and hit the execute key. The terminal screen froze. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from the base of the conveyor belt. The flashing red alarms instantly switched to a calm, steady green. The robotic arms hissed, resetting their hydraulic joints, and the massive belt roared smoothly back to life. The production line was completely saved. The surrounding workers erupted into a massive wave of cheers and applause, clapping her on the back. Tasha stepped back from the terminal, her chest heaving, looking at her calloused hands with a profound sense of genuine unearned pride. She had finally stepped out of my shadow and proven her own absolute worth. High above the roaring factory floor, the expansive chairman's suite was completely dark, save for the cool blue light radiating from a massive bank of high-definition security monitors. I was not asleep. I was sitting perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the live feed from Sector 7. I had witnessed the entire sequence unfold in real time. I saw the machinery fail. I saw the foreman panic. and I saw my daughter step forward, block the radio transmission, and flawlessly execute a highly advanced diagnostic bypass using the exact same logic principles I had taught her when she was just a little girl. She had saved the line, but more importantly, she had completely saved herself. She had finally learned the absolute, undeniable value of getting her hands dirty. A slow, genuine smile broke across my face, the very first real smile I had allowed myself to feel in over 6 months. The grueling, punishing crucible I had forced her into had worked perfectly. The entitled, arrogant woman who had married a federal criminal was dead and gone. The fierce, capable, and brilliant daughter I had raised was finally back. I set my coffee cup down on the polished mahogany desk, reached for my private secure phone, and dialed a highly restricted number. The line rang twice before being answered. "Martin," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet, empty office. "The trial period is officially over. She is ready. Call your legal team and wake them up. It is time to draft the final document." The morning sun was just beginning to cast long, sharp shadows across the city skyline when I walked into Martin Thorne's executive office. It was exactly 7 o'clock. Martin was already sitting behind his massive oak desk, a fresh pot of dark roast coffee steaming between 2 porcelain cups. We had dismantled corporate empires together, legally executed treacherous executives, and reclaimed my entire life's work in this very room. But today was profoundly different. Today was not about destroying my enemies or seizing control of a boardroom. Today was about permanently securing my legacy. I sat down in the heavy leather guest chair and placed my hands flat on the desk. Martin looked at me, his sharp, predatory eyes softening into a gaze of profound mutual respect. He knew why I had called him in the middle of the night. He had seen the security footage I forwarded to his encrypted server. He knew Tasha had stepped up, taken control, and saved the manufacturing line using her own intellect and sheer grit. The brutal crucible I had put her through had worked perfectly, but my age was an inescapable reality. I was nearing 70 years old, holding absolute control over a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire. It was time to architect an ironclad succession plan. "I need a master trust, Martin," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet office. "Not a standard inheritance. I need a fortress. Something so legally impenetrable that no corporate vulture, no greedy board member, and absolutely no parasitic ex-husband can ever breach its walls." Martin nodded slowly, opening a thick, pristine legal pad. He picked up his expensive fountain pen, ready to draft the final blueprint of my empire. "Tell me the exact parameters," Dexter Martin replied. "Let us build your fortress." I leaned forward, dictating the terms with the exact same precision I used when writing complex operating codes. The entirety of my estate, including my 51% controlling stake in the manufacturing subsidiary, my liquid assets, and my extensive real estate portfolio will be transferred into an irrevocable blind trust. Tasha will be the sole primary beneficiary, but she will not receive a single dime upon my death. The trust will be strictly and heavily conditional. Martin began writing rapidly, his pen scratching loudly against the heavy paper. "Specify the conditions," he prompted. "I want a 5-year active employment mandate," I stated firmly. "Tasha has proven she can handle the pressure of the factory floor, but true character is built through sustained, relentless endurance. She must maintain continuous full-time employment at the manufacturing plant for exactly 5 consecutive years. If she quits, if she demands a nepotism promotion to the executive suite without earning it, or if she abandons her post for any reason other than a verified medical emergency, the trust completely locks her out. She gets absolutely nothing." Martin raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by the rigid, uncompromising nature of the condition. "And what happens after the 5-year mark?" he asked. "After 5 years of unbroken service, the trust will begin dispersing quarterly dividends from the corporate profits," I explained. "She will be incredibly wealthy, but she will never be handed the keys to the kingdom all at once. Furthermore, the trust will permanently withhold her voting rights regarding corporate liquidation. Tasha will possess zero legal authority to ever sell the company, break up the assets, or auction off my proprietary software patents. The company must remain a functioning, operational manufacturing entity. It will continue to provide stable jobs for the workers she currently bleeds alongside on the assembly line. She will enjoy the fruits of the empire, but she will never have the power to dismantle it. The legacy continues, indefinitely protecting the people who actually do the heavy lifting." Martin smiled, tapping his pen against the desk. It is brilliant, Dexter. You are forcing her to remain grounded. You are ensuring she never reverts back to the entitled corporate wife she used to be. But we are not finished, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register. There is one final absolute contingency we must hardwire into this legal framework. We need a poison pill. Martin stopped writing and looked up, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Bradley is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I continued, the very mention of my former son-in-law leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. 10 years is a long time, but it is not forever. Criminals like him are exceptionally skilled at manipulation. They play the victim, they feign rehabilitation, and they exploit the empathy of the people they previously abused. I know my daughter has grown stronger, but I refuse to leave even a microscopic crack in the armor of my estate. I want a zero-tolerance proximity clause woven directly into the core of the trust. Martin leaned in closely, his eyes narrowing with intense focus. Define zero tolerance, he said softly. If Tasha ever reestablishes a romantic relationship with Bradley upon his release, the trust instantly detonates. I commanded, my words heavy with absolute finality. If she remarries him, if she cohabitates with him, or if she provides him with a single cent of financial support, she is immediately and permanently disinherited. Furthermore, this clause extends to his entire bloodline. If she attempts to funnel my wealth to any of his relatives, the exact same penalty applies. Martin nodded, writing the draconian stipulations onto the legal pad. And where do the assets go if she triggers this poison pill, he asked. The entirety of the estate will be instantly liquidated and transferred to a newly established philanthropic foundation, I stated proudly. It will fund full-ride university scholarships and startup grants exclusively for young, underprivileged black engineers. The money will build the next generation of innovators who actually possess the talent and the grit to change the world, rather than lining the pockets of a white-collar parasite. The wealth will serve the community, and Bradley will never touch a single dime of my legacy. Martin closed his legal pad, a look of profound respect washing over his face. It is an absolute masterpiece of estate planning, Dexter. It is legally bulletproof. No judge in the country will be able to break this trust. For the next 4 hours, Martin and his elite team of estate lawyers meticulously drafted the complex legal framework. When the final massive stack of documents was placed on the desk in front of me, I read through every single clause with surgical precision. Finding no flaws, I picked up the heavy fountain pen and signed my name across the bottom line, officially cementing the future of my bloodline and my empire. Martin gathered the documents and locked them securely away. I stood up, thanked him for his decades of loyal service, and returned to my private executive suite at the corporate headquarters. I sat alone behind my massive mahogany desk, the weight of the day settling comfortably over my shoulders. I pulled a piece of heavy personalized stationery from my top drawer and picked up my pen. I began to write a deeply personal handwritten letter to Tasha. It contained the brutal truths, the hard lessons, and the profound unconditional love of a father who had forced his daughter through hell to save her soul. It was a letter meant to be read only after I was gone. I folded the parchment carefully, placed it into a thick envelope, and sealed it. I walked over to the heavy steel wall safe, hidden behind a painting, inputted the biometric code, and placed the letter inside, locking it away for the future. Exactly 1 year later, I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the chairman's suite. I had recently celebrated my 70th birthday, but I felt more powerful and invigorated than I had in decades. I wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, my posture straight, my hands clasped loosely behind my back as I surveyed my kingdom. Down below, the sprawling semiconductor manufacturing floor operated with absolute breathtaking perfection. The heavy mechanical hum of the assembly line reverberated softly through the reinforced glass, a steady and reassuring heartbeat. The robotic arms pivoted and locked into place with flawless precision, bathed in the steady glow of green operational lights. There were no sirens. There were no flashing red warnings of critical overloads. The entire grid was a masterclass in engineered efficiency, functioning exactly the way I had designed it to. I was no longer the ghost in the machine, hidden away in a server room and taken for granted by men who could not even comprehend the code I wrote. I was the undisputed architect of this empire, standing at its absolute pinnacle. Every single microchip that rolled off that pristine assembly line generated wealth that flowed directly into my personal holding companies and the charitable foundations I had established. I watched the heavily coordinated movements of the floor technicians, marveling at the sheer discipline and synchronized rhythm of the workforce. They moved with purpose and pride, knowing that the man sitting in the corner office above them actually understood their daily struggles and deeply respected their labor. I had stabilized the company, doubled the quarterly profit margins, and created a working environment completely devoid of the toxic, arrogant corporate parasites who had previously infested the executive levels. My eyes scanned the bustling sector, 7 stopping on a familiar figure navigating the complex machinery. Tasha was wearing her heavy protective gear, a bright yellow hard hat, and thick industrial safety goggles. She had recently earned a hard-fought promotion to shift supervisor, a title she secured purely through her own relentless dedication and technical merit without a single ounce of assistance from my office. She paused her inspection of a thermal regulator, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, and glanced up toward the towering glass window of my suite. Even from this distance, I could see the genuine bright smile break across her face. She offered a firm, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal but necessary journey we had taken together. I nodded back, a deep swell of paternal pride warming my chest. She had finally become a woman of substance. Her transformation stood in stark, glorious contrast to the pathetic fate of the men who had attempted to destroy us. Bradley was currently rotting inside a 12 by 8-foot concrete cell at a maximum security federal penitentiary. Stripped of his tailored suits and his stolen corporate wealth, he was reduced to a simple inmate number. He spent his days scrubbing prison cafeteria floors, a poetic and devastating justice for a man who had once mocked my daughter for doing the exact same labor. His arrogant sneer had been permanently erased, replaced by the crushing, inescapable reality that he would spend the next decade locked in a cage, completely forgotten by the world he had tried to manipulate. And then there was Carter, the brilliant young chief operating officer who had foolishly fired me over a brief phone call, had experienced an equally spectacular descent into absolute obscurity. My legal team kept tabs on his whereabouts purely for my own amusement. Having been universally blacklisted by every single technology firm and corporate entity in the country, Carter was currently working as a graveyard shift cashier at a dingy, rundown gas station on the outskirts of the city. He spent his nights wearing a cheap polyester uniform, ringing up stale coffee and packs of cigarettes behind a wall of bulletproof glass, earning minimum wage. His highly expensive business degree and his boundless unearned ego were completely useless in his new pathetic reality. I turned away from the panoramic window and walked slowly back to my massive mahogany desk. I picked up a porcelain cup of dark, bitter coffee, letting the rich aroma fill the quiet office. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the absolute magnitude of my victory wash over my mind. They had looked at my gray hair, my quiet demeanor, and my 69 years of age, and they had made a fatal miscalculation. They saw a disposable relic. They saw an outdated piece of machinery that could simply be unplugged, discarded, and replaced by something younger and cheaper. They thought my decades of loyal service equated to a pathetic, weak submission. They genuinely believed that because I did not walk around the factory demanding unearned respect or flashing my wealth, I was entirely powerless. But they fundamentally misunderstood the harsh, unforgiving laws of survival. They forgot that true power does not need to announce its presence. True power operates in the shadows, quietly building its defenses, securing its leverage, and preparing for the exact moment the enemy makes a mistake. Carter and Bradley thought they were playing a simple game of corporate checkers, moving pieces around a board to steal a budget. They had no idea they were sitting at a chessboard I had designed, playing with pieces I legally owned, and walking blindly into a trap I had set years in advance. They mistook my age for vulnerability, failing to realize that with age comes a profound, lethal patience. I did not need to scream or throw tantrums when they tried to strip away my livelihood. I simply collected my property, stepped out of the building, and allowed their own staggering incompetence to set their empire on fire. I let them hang themselves with the rope they had so eagerly braided. I dismantled their careers, seized their wealth, and legally banished them to the absolute bottom of the societal hierarchy without ever raising my voice. I set the coffee cup down on the desk, the soft clink echoing with finality in the grand silent room. The corporate world is a ruthless, unforgiving ecosystem. and it severely punishes those who fail to respect the foundations upon which they stand. They thought they could simply chop down an old tree because its leaves were no longer bright and green. But the older the tree, the deeper and stronger its roots pierce straight through the concrete. When you carelessly swing an axe at that tree, you do not realize that its massive roots are wrapped entirely around the foundation of your own house. And when I walked away, I did not just leave my job. I pulled their entire empire down into the dirt with me. The greatest lesson I learned through this entire ordeal is that your value is not determined by the people who lack the vision to see it. When someone tries to diminish your worth or convince you that your best days are behind you, never internalize their ignorance. True strength is knowing exactly what you bring to the table and having the courage to walk away when that contribution is blatantly disrespected. Sometimes you have to let everything burn to the ground so you can clear the ashes and rebuild a kingdom with people who actually deserve to stand beside you. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences of standing up to toxic people in the comments below.